Hello guys, welcome to Soul Fiction. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto trained under Zoro and learned 3-sword ninjutsu? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. 3 Blades in the Rain. The storm off the sea came in like a drunk wrestler, unsteady, loud, and determined to shove the great Naruto bridge into the dark. Wind pushed sheets of rain sideways. Waves brooded and then leapt, gutting themselves on the concrete pylons. Somewhere in that noise, Naruto counted his breaths. 4 on the draw, 2 on the step, 1 on the cut. He said it inside his head and sometimes with his teeth, jaw tight around a lacquered mouth grip that looked like a stick and weighed like a brick. 2 shadow clones moved with him, shoulders touching his in the white blur of water. They were him, and not. They fell when he did and learned when he learned, and lately, they were the ones who got scolded when his centerline wandered. The bridge was slick. The bridge had always been slick. It was built out of stubbornness and a promise, and it remembered. Naruto grinned at the thought, then tasted rain and salt and wood resin. He felt for the pitch of the deck through his sandals and set his feet again. Left angled out, right turned in, weight down not forward. The mouth grip dragged his head posture lower than he liked, but he held it steady, shoulders quiet, hands light. A wave opped the rim and splashed cold across his shins. It counted as a signal. He moved. The kunai in his right hand cut a line no thicker than a nerve. The offhand palm shot the second kunai forward like a dart. The clones crossed behind him. 1 high, 1 low, and their kicks made the rain change direction. You could cut rain, if you were petty enough. You could use it as practice, if you were honest. Naruto made it practice. The mouth grip stayed centered, unmoving, until he had to whip his head and bit down so hard his molars sang. The grip clicked. He held the line. The bridge bucked slightly. Something thumped the pylons below. Naruto frowned around the grip and looked over the rail. Farther out where the chop slapped and reset, a fishing skiff had turned sideways to the swell and was baying bullied at an angle you only saw on bad days and funerals. Someone had tied a rope around the bow and the bridge footing. The rope had looped 3 times and now it was doing what rope did, strangling everything it touched. Idiot. Naruto breathed, and he was running before the word finished. The clones hit the rail and went over. Naruto went with them, palms on wet beam, feet planted wide, and then air. Rain swallowed noise except for the skiff's hull banging like a big drum. He landed on the gunwale, slid, caught the mast. A boy in an orange hood, no older than Naruto had been when everyone. He pretended not to see him, had both hands around the rope and a look like prayer and stubbornness mixed into mud. Hey, Naruto said through the mouthpiece, and the boy's eyes flicked to the thing in his teeth and got big. You can let go now. If I let go it's going to do whatever it wants anyway. Naruto wedged himself between mast and bench, bit down on the mouth grip, and made a choice with his hands. He passed a kunai from palm to palm, felt the boat's hateful tilt, and then leaned back. The rope tightened. His teeth sang again. The rain made a white curtain. Count with me, he told the boy. Voice dampened by the grip. 4 breaths. Ready. 4. 3. The boy tried. On 2. The boat kicked. On 1. Naruto rolled his shoulders, set the blade against the rope, and cut without moving the rest of him at all. The rope didn't part so much as decide it was 2 ropes now. The tension disappeared. The skiff sprang away from the pylon like it had been waiting to run. Get your head down. Naruto shoved the boy into the bottom of the boat with a forearm, and then they were clear, and then they weren't, because the boat spun and the next swell picked them up like a hand. Naruto planted the mouth grip against his teeth and bit. The world narrowed. He sang the breath counts against the push in his lungs and made the cuts the water asked for. The boat obeyed him just enough. He stole 3 moments from the sea. He gave 1 back. They slid toward the bridge steps at a bad angle, but manageable. He threw the kunai handle first to the first clone and saw his own face flicker with concentration. The rain in that moment came at them sideways and then up. The second clone grabbed the bow, feet skidding, and slammed it into wood. Naruto went from boat to beam like there had always been a bridge made to fit his feet. He lifted the boy out by the back of his coat. The boy clung like all boys cling when they think they're not allowed to cry yet. Naruto leaned him against the pile guard and thumped his shoulder. "You're fine," he said. "You're going to throw up in about a minute. Aim for the sea, not the bridge." The boy's mouth worked. He nodded hard. He stared at the mouth grip like it was a snake. Naruto spat the grip into his palm and rolled his jaw, feeling the ache settle deep. "Don't bite ropes," he said, deadpan. "They fight back." He felt the look before he saw it. Some presences pushed. Others didn't have to. This one was like standing next to a big bell that hadn't rung yet. The rowboat nudged at a lower ladder, as if it had been waiting for the weather to clap right then. A man hauled himself up from the far side as if the slick wood were just a hill he didn't like. He wore 3 swords at his hip like that was normal. He had a scar that said more than most conversations. His hair was green. That last part felt like a dare. "Your centerline's trash," the man said. Naruto snorted and pointed at the skiff and the boy. "Boat's not in pieces, kid still got all his parts. That's passing in this storm." The man stepped up without looking at his feet and took one of Naruto's dropped kunai off the deck. He spun it once, not fancy, just to feel the weight. "Passing kills you when it's dark and you're tired. You want to live, learn to bite steel." "I'm literally biting." The flat of the kunai wrapped Naruto's sword hand so fast he didn't see the shoulder move. It stung. Naruto's clone hissed and went out like a candle. Naruto blinked. His grin came back, sharper. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He bit the grip again. The stranger flicked the kunai away and put his hand on one of his swords and then just looked at him. The look said, as clearly as words, "Show me." Naruto showed him. They moved under the storm and inside it. The bridge gave them a narrow world with edges. Naruto turned the 3 yards in front of him into an arm's length. It was a trick he'd been practicing. Keep the problem close enough to feel it breathe. He led with the clones. Let his real feet lag a fraction, watched the man's eyes flick between faces and decided he didn't care about the bait. The man took the bait anyway. His blade flashed out and stopped a thumb width from the mouth. Grip without touching it, and Naruto felt the cut. It wasn't on him, it was in the air where his breath had just been. He laughed, reflexive, and then shut it down. No wasted motion. The thought didn't feel like his. But it fit. Naruto cut at the space the man would have to leave, not where he was. The man stepped where the cut wanted him, like he'd been invited, and made Naruto pay for it by tapping his knee with a scabbard and stealing his balance. Naruto would have gone down. The clone shouldered into his back and took his weight and then was gone in a slick of rain and chakra. "Again," the man said. They did it until the black in the clouds thinned to charcoal and the waves stopped throwing themselves at the pylons like drunks apologizing. At some point, Naruto realized the man wasn't trying to kill him or test him. He was teaching him by not talking. He took what Naruto offered and returned it in the smallest, neatest packages, a wrist correction here, a hip check there, a quiet murder of bad habits. Naruto had learned 100 jutsu and 20 ways to lie to himself with them. This was different. Sometimes the answers had you bite your own lip until the ood tasted like pennies and get back on your feet. They found a pocket of windbreak under a tarp bolted to a scaffolding. Someone had left fish on a rack. Naruto had put them there earlier with the thought of eating when he was satisfied. He wasn't satisfied. He ate anyway. The man ate, too, like someone who never worried about whether there'd be more food later. "What do I call you?" Naruto asked. When his tongue remembered it was allowed. "Because green hair makes it sound like I don't respect you, and I'm trying to be a person today." The man chewed, swallowed, and spoke like it didn't matter. "Zoro. Zoro." Naruto let it sit in his jaw like a weight. "I'm Naruto." I guessed. Naruto squinted. "Because the bridge says so. Because you move like your name is something you have to tell people twice." Naruto couldn't argue with that. He licked salt off his thumb. "You always show up in storms to hit teenagers with the flat of a blade. Storms keep people honest. And you're not a teenager. You're a swordsman who forgot he needed 3 hands. I don't have 3 hands. Bite the blade." Naruto bit the mouth grip again on principle. Zoro regarded the grip, mildly offended by its existence. "Not that. Real steel. Naruto rolled his shoulders. You're serious. Zoro looked out at the gray water like it was an old friend and an old enemy at once. His voice barely moved. If you lie to your own hands, you die stupid. That landed somewhere. Naruto didn't want to die. He didn't want to do it stupid least of all. He stood up, the ache settling into his calves like friendly dogs, and raised a hand. Show me. Zoro didn't show so much as take things away until Naruto had to find them again. He took away room, then time, then the helpful habit of looking at the blade instead of the shoulders. He gave Naruto a strip of cloth and a rounded piece of metal and told him to hold it between his teeth and run. When Naruto stumbled, Zoro tapped his shin with a scabbard and made him do it again. When Naruto went to cut a thrown melon in half because he could, Zoro barked, "No wasted cuts," and Naruto saw the chalk mark on a different one at the edge of his vision and pivoted without thinking to cut that. And only that. The rain came down and hid his smile. They didn't talk about philosophy. Zoro had 3 rules and none of them were long enough to be mistaken for a speech. He carved them into the rail with the tip of his sword when the sky went from charcoal to pearl and then to a damp bleached blue. Bite steel. Don't lie to your hands. No wasted cuts. Naruto ran his thumb over the grooves. The letters were straight and deep and would be there when the bridge was old enough to forget the men who carved them. Zoro wrapped a bundle in oilcloth and put it on the bench without comment. He finished tying the last knot with a tug that made the rope sigh. He looked at the sea. You're going. Storm's moving. So am I. Naruto had a pile of questions he could have own in 100 ways to try to keep him. He wasn't foolish enough to use any of them. He put a palm on the oilcloth and felt the humming weight of a blade even through the wrap. He said, simply, "Thank you." Zoro didn't nod. He didn't need to. He turned and went back the way he came, feet steady on the slick wood, boat waiting like he'd told it to stay. When he dropped down to it, the water took him without foam. Naruto sat with the oilcloth bundle for a minute longer than made sense. He didn't open it. He didn't need to yet. He wanted to carry the weight without the shape for a little while. Hey, a voice cut through the rain, cheerful, a little breathless. Bridge boy, could use a hand with the customs man before he falls asleep on my paperwork. The caravan coming from the town creaked and bickered like all caravans. Chizuna's son-in-law was probably pretending not to recognize Naruto from the way he never quite looked directly at him and never quite smiled either. At the front of the cart with the good shocks and the tarp tied properly, a girl stood on the brake beam like a circus performer, hair tied up, eyes sharp enough to trim rope. She wore the easy grin of someone who old make you buy your own goods back if she got bored. Tenten, Naruto said. It came out as a smile wrapped around a name. She hopped down and shouldered the paperwork sack onto him with a friendly thump. Naruto, you look like you slept with a mouth guard and a grudge. I slept with a storm and poor life choices. What have you got? She flipped the tarp corner like it was a stage trick. The OTS underneath were black as wet ravens and banded with a pale ore that looked like it had thought about glowing but decided it was too early to make a scene. I brought your weird metal, Tenten said, pleased. Smuggled it legally. Signed every sheet twice. Can we move it somewhere that isn't going to turn me into lightning bait? Naruto put his fingers on the corner of one ingot. The hum under his skin felt like a string pulled tight over a deep hollow. He didn't need Zoro to tell him steel had a voice. This one sang under his bones. It felt like potential, like a breath he hadn't let out yet. Tenten tilted her head at the bundle under his arm. New toy, gift, mysterious. She peered closer at the oilcloth, then at his face, then at his jaw. And those teeth marks on your mouth stick are a cry for help. It's training. He protested around a jaw that had decided to ache loudly now the work was paused. The bruises under your chin agree. Next you're going to ask someone to weld a handle to a boulder so you can chew it for core strength. Naruto found himself laughing, the kind that made his ribs feel like they were being rung with small bells. How much to add a bite cap to a short blade and not make it weird? Tenten pretended to think, eyes dancing. Depends. Weird costs extra. But I can be bribed with fish and the good tea. I have one fish left and it tastes like humility. Perfect. Humility is my favorite spice. They moved the ingots into a warehouse Tazuna had built out of materials that had already been part of 3 other, worse buildings in their lives. Naruto took more weight than he needed to and didn't make a show of it. Tenten caught him adjusting his grip with a knee and nodded like a blacksmith's apprentice who'd seen the technique done wrong one too many times and was pleased to see it done right. On the way back out, a fisherman's wife brushed past Naruto with a basket and didn't look at him twice. That shouldn't have hurt, it didn't. But he noticed. He always noticed. The rain softened to a gray curtain, the wind lost its temper, and the bridge began to smell like wet rope and iron and sea. Naruto unwrapped the oilcloth at last. The sword inside was wrapped again in silk. Because some things shouldn't touch the world all at once. He pulled the silk back. The blade was pale and thin and honest. He set it on his palms and it asked to be held, not worshipped. The scabbard was simple, the tsuba a quiet oval. Near the base of the blade, in kanji so small he had to tilt it to see, a name had been cut. Ukifune. Drift boat. Tenten whistled. Lo, she's light, she's mine, Naruto said, and the word didn't feel like ownership, it felt like a promise he couldn't name yet. They found the 3 lines carved into the rail when Tenten went to scold the customs man into stamping the right box. She bent and read them under her breath and raised an eyebrow. Bite steel, she repeated, amused. Sounds like the kind of thing you'd write on a dare. I'm taking it seriously. Good, you'll have to. Because we've got company. Naruto didn't hear footsteps. He didn't hear anything except the rain and the soft groan of the bridge settling. And the complaint of a cart axle in need of grease. But the air changed, the way it did when a fight was going to happen, thin, and waiting. A man in white walked into that waiting. He wasn't important by height or weight. He was important because he was the only thing not wet. Rain struck the air around him and thought better of it. He wore a white cloak that swung without wind. Behind him, 2 meters. Or men and a woman unspooled lengths of something chalk pale from reels, like ribbon for a gift you didn't want. Naruto had time to think, that's interesting, and then the nearest of the pale lines and the hair at the base of his neck stood up. It wasn't chakra, it was the absence of it, the feeling of a shout that had been cut out of the air and forgotten. The customs man blinked at the WHITE man like he was trying to place a face. He looked down at his stamp, up at the man, back down. He lifted the stamp, hesitated, and set it on the paper at a random angle. His hand shook. Tenten's humor dried out of her tone like someone had wrung it. Naruto, she said quietly. Those lines. Don't touch them. The woman in white smiled at him with accurate politeness. Her hands didn't stop moving. The lines arced, thin as fishing gut, bright as bone. They crossed the bridge in 3 neat sweeps, low, high, and middle. They weren't meant to cut flesh. Naruto felt that in his bones. They were meant to slice whatever tied things together. A man 3 carts down swayed and looked at his wife like she was a stranger who'd wandered too close to his goods. Panic began, not with a scream, but with the lack of one. Naruto moved down. He barked to the caravan, to Tenten, to the bridge, to the sea. He didn't wait to see who listened. He tucked Ukifune between his teeth and drew with both hands at once, steel speaking twice. A quiet hello. The posture felt wrong for a heartbeat, then right. The jaw took weight and gave him a spine. His shoulders found the angle Zoro had tapped into him by force. He stepped into the space the lines would have to cross and set his breath. 4 on the draw. The first line reached for him. He reached back, not with his hands, but with the wind that lived in his fingers when he let it. It hugged the blade thin and true. The pale line met the wind and stuttered, suddenly unsure of its own existence. He rode that uncertainty with the smallest movement and the steel did the rest. The line came apart the way a bad story does when you ask it a simple question. 2 on the step. He saw the second line trying to be clever and go low. He left the cut in the air and stepped over it without looking down. Ukifune's spine kissed his teeth and hummed. He didn't smile. He didn't waste anything. 1 on the cut. The third line aimed for his throat at a polite angle. He met it with the offhand blade and turned his head just enough to keep the edge from breaking his teeth. The line recoiled like something had bitten it. Ukifune snapped forward with no more motion than a nod. The cut happened without announcing itself. By then, the men in white had realized he wasn't a civilian with a mouth problem. They spread out, which meant they were trained. They didn't shout or posture. They lifted their hands and the lines lifted with them and the world thinned in 3 places at once. Naruto smelled paper and incense under the rain. He tasted chalk. He was fast when he had to be. But speed wasn't what the bridge needed. The bridge needed the crowd not to be cut off from their names. Naruto made the choice his body had already decided on. He yelled, "NT!" His sound hit the caravanners where their decisions lived. Tenten. Stalls to windbreaks. Left carts. Roll back. Close ranks. Do it now. Tenten didn't need a second instruction. She snapped a tarp free. With a flick that wrapped it around a line and dragged it to the deck where it hissed and ate a chalk scar into the planks. She drove a chain bolt through a reel with a throw that didn't look like much and sounded like a solution. Her hands moved like music. Naruto cut for the places where the lines, owners didn't want him. He didn't aim for flesh. He aimed for wrists, for reels, for the small s. Chances people forget when they think they're holding all the cards. He kept his cuts honest. Zoro's scabbard could have found his shin from wherever he was. Naruto felt the ghost tap and shifted anyway. A line grazed his shoulder, not the meat, but the part of him that was stitched to other parts of him. He stumbled with both feet and both hearts. The fox inside him snarled out of habit and then skipped. The missing beat left a hole with cold edges. He almost looked down to see if the hole was visible. His clones flickered and brightened and one went out with a sound like a candle dying in a jar. Naruto breathed very carefully and decided to be furious later. "Keep moving," Tenten shouted without looking at him, which saved him. "If you stop, they'll cage you." He moved. Ukifune lived in his jaw and the 2 shorter blades lived in his hands, and for the first time that posture felt like it had always been what his body had wanted. He caught the flicker of the man in white's eyes when he realized Naruto wasn't going to tire himself out with big swings. Naruto kept his steps small and rude. He made the lines come to him and convinced them to be wrong about their angles. A white-cloaked figure near the back raised something like a bell striker made for a church that didn't believe in sound. He drew it back. Naruto knew in his bones what the toll would do. The first pulse had washed the color out of one woman's eyes for a blink. The second would wash something else, something you couldn't get back by saying sorry. He didn't get there in time. Yugao would have, but he didn't know her yet. He got there exactly late enough to alter what happened. He spat Ukifune into his hand and threw it. It wasn't a throw like a ninja knife. It was a draw and a cut all at once that happened in the air. Ukifune didn't spin. She slid on the thin sleeve of wind he gave her and cut the bell striker at the band where the wood met the chalk. The striker fell in 2 soft pieces and the bell, never rung, remembered its job too late. The man in white stared at his empty hands and then up at Naruto with a look people kept for dogs that turned out to be wolves. He reached for another tool and found Tenten instead. She'd used the chain bolt like a sewing needle, threading the line reels to their own harness rings. She grinned at him bright as a knife. "Hi," she said, "I steal things that hurt people." She jerked the chain. The reels clacked and locked. The lines went slack where they shouldn't have, and 3 people in the caravan said each other's names at the same time like breathing after being underwater. The white-cloaked woman stepped forward, eyes cool, and lifted a hand. The air wavered near the back of her wrist, where a ward cut into her skin glowed through rain. Naruto saw the shape of the sigil when a drop slid off it and didn't break. A crescent with a cutout of it. Something missing. Something hungry. He didn't say anything. He just moved. 2 clones pushed a cart into the line of sight of the third white robe. That one cut it neatly in half without a ripple of satisfaction. Naruto had the angle by then. He slipped under the raised arm, put his mouth to Ukifune's grip again, and made a cut so small he almost didn't feel it happen. The ward's line parted. Blood didn't come. Light did, thin and wintry, and then it went out. The woman gasped like someone had reached into her chest and removed a certainty she'd had since she was 5. She fell without falling. Her knees found the deck. The chalk ribbon at her belt lay dull as spoiled milk. Without its hum, the rain rushed back into place. The white man at the front looked at Naruto for the first time like he was measuring a problem. His eyes were clear. His smile made promises that weren't about mercy. He Ed his hand as if he were about to bless the bridge. Enough, Naruto said. He didn't shout. He spoke with a blade in his teeth and blood in his mouth and rain in his eyes. Take your strings and go. Something cold rippled out from the man's palm, as if a fogbank had decided it wanted to be horizontal. It rolled toward Naruto at ankle height and chest height and head height, 3 bands, neat and quiet. If they touched him, something that wasn't muscle would come apart. Naruto didn't meet them. He used the breath he had and the rules he'd been handed on Salt Wind. 4 on the draw, 2 on the step, 1 on the cut. The first band reached for his feet. He didn't give them. He stepped where his body had learned to live last night between lightning and lecture. The second band wanted his chest. He gave it the exhale, not the rib cage. The third wanted his throat. He gave it steel. Ukifun, light, honest, took the wind and became a line too fine to argue with. He made 1 cut in air nothing should hold. The band parted, a sound like a thread breaking in a quiet room. Enough of the white cloaks understood that they were going to lose the rest of their toys if they stayed. The man in front flicked his fingers and the lines reeled back with shamed speed. He adjusted his cloak like a priest being careful not to step in something. We will take what belongs to the White Shrine, he said. Like he expected the name to do half the work for him. Then break into a library, Tenten said under her breath. We're fresh out of relics. His eyes slipped over her as if he were choosing which parts of the crowd were people. When they came back to Naruto, they were thoughtful. You felt it, he murmured. The missing. You wear too many knots already. We will take them off, boy. Naruto bit WN and tasted iron where his teeth had worried a cut on his tongue. You can try. He didn't lunge. He didn't preen. He let the man look, and let the man weigh, and let the man decide that today wasn't the day. The man nodded once, curt. The white cloaks withdrew. They left the chalk bands where they lay to smear into the bridge's pores and trouble someone else's day with bad dreams. Naruto stood, very still until his body remembered how to move without telling him. He took Ukifun out of his mouth and wiped the blade on a strip of clean cloth. He checked the edge by pressing his breath against it and feeling the air skip. He sheathed her. Tenten came up and put a hand on his arm and didn't pretend he didn't need the steadying. You okay? I'm going to be furious later, he said, repeating the promise he'd made himself. Schedule it. I'll bring tea. Who were those priests of fashion? They said, White Shrine. He said it to see if the bridge reacted. It didn't. They cut. Not us. The space between us. The parts that know names. Tenten's mouth thinned. She bent, picked up a chalk chip that hadn't melted yet, and dropped it into a little leather pouch like someone picking up a snake egg. I'll poke it, carefully. Don't do it alone. She bumped his shoulder. I'd be offended if you thought I would. I like my bonds exactly where I left them. She glanced out at the sea. The rain had slackened to a patter. A forgiveness. What are you going to do? Naruto followed the line of the bridge with his eyes until it ran out at the far bank and turned into road. They hunt the things that tie people together. They'll come for people like me. Maybe they were already coming and we just met early. Doesn't matter. That's not an answer, Tenten said, but she said it fondly, like H.E. was a puzzle box she liked prying open. He turned and looked at the 3 lines on the rail. He put his thumb in the grooves and felt how clean they were. I'm not waiting for them to cut something I need, he said. I'm going to take the fight out of the places where people live. I'm going to meet them where their lines begin. Tenten's grin sharpened. Good. I hate reactive plans. They always get mud on my boots. They worked the rest of the day without drama. Which is to say there was drama, but it came from a wheel stuck in a rut, not from God-baiting zealots in laundry whites. Tizuna SW. Or and the customs man finally found his stamp in the right hand. The rain hesitated, reconsidered, and became weather instead of a weapon. At dusk, Naruto found himself alone at the outer edge of the bridge under a sky that had decided to be thoughtful about stars. The wind came in slow. The sea had had its tantrum and now wanted to talk about it. He took the chalk chip from Tenten's pouch where she'd left it on a crate with a note that said, "Poke it together, idiot." He ignored the note for exactly the amount of time it took to walk 10 steps. He set the chip on a cracked mast someone had and against the rail to make it feel useful. The chalk was stubborn. It remembered the band that had been carved into it. It remembered a command. He put Ukifune between his teeth. This wasn't about the chalk. It wasn't even about the white shrine. It was about the 3 lines he'd been given and the man who'd taken the storm with him and the way the bridge felt under his feet when he was honest. He planted his feet. He let his shoulders settle. He breathed. 4 on the draw. The draw wasn't big. It was a thought crossing his jaw muscles. Ukifune moved like a boat in small waves. The wind folded around her without complaint. 2 on the step. He shifted his weight the way the deck wanted it. He could feel the sea humming under the concrete. He stepped into the hum. 1 on the cut. He did not swing. He did not reach. He closed his teeth around the grip and made the littlest motion you could make and still call it deliberate. The blade didn't touch the mast. The air did. A line happened where there hadn't been one. And the chalk sigil dropped away from the wood as if it had been ashamed to be attached to anything. The storm held its breath. It really did. The sea paused between one avenue and the next, and the wind had the grace to go still long enough for the sound of the cut to stand alone. It sounded like a truth being told in a room where everyone had been lying politely. Naruto caught the little chalk crescent before it hit the deck. He turned it over in his fingers and then let it go into the leather pouch with Tenten's other patient nightmares. His jaw ached like a lesson well learned. He touched the 3 rules again without reading them and looked out at the road that was going to be the rest of his week. Bite steel, he said softly. No lies. No waste. He said Ukifune at his hip with the others and rolled his shoulders. Somewhere in the dark, a fisherman sang to himself, off-key and happy to be headed home. Naruto listened to it for the length of 3 breaths. Then he started walking. Chapter 1 end. Chapter 2. Crosswinds at the Sand Gate. The last of Waves' rain clung to the canvas when they crossed out of green and into heat. The road to the wind border and through scrub that smelled like sage and stone. By noon the breeze had stopped pretending to be kind and started licking sweat out of the collar. Feels like a kiln, Tenten said, adjusting the strap across her chest without slowing. If a kiln was also a hairdryer with abandonment issues. Naruto rolled his shoulders under the pack and kept his jaw loose. The mouth grip hung on a cord at his chest like an odd charm. Too heavy to forget, too useful to put away. He'd switched Ukifune to a short scabbard that sat high above his right hip. His 2 old Konoha blades rode left and small of the back. They didn't hum like the ore ingots. But they knew him, and he knew how they wanted to be held. Zoro's rules sat where his breath did. Bite steel. Don't lie to your hands. No wasted cuts. The Sand Gate wasn't a gate so much as a clever insult to the desert. 2 towers of pale stone leaned inward, wind-scoured and rope-scarred, with a shadowed bazaar spilled between them like a secret someone had dropped. Colored glass hung from stringing wires and flashed in the sun. Banners snapped. People bargained in voices tuned to wind and dust. A border official stamped papers with the rhythmic vigor of a man who had lost wars to boredom and intended to win this one. Welcome to Suna's throat, Tenten said. If you can talk here without eating sand, you can talk anywhere. They found shade under. An awning dyed a blue that wanted to be cold. Naruto let the air settle on his skin and the noise filter into familiar patterns. Water sellers with bells, kids chasing a hoop with the single-minded joy that makes adults ache. The thin song of glass chimes dreaming they were ice. He liked borders. They let people pretend to be new to each other. Paperwork, Tenten murmured, and slid into the line W. ITH, the easy hip of someone who could turn bureaucracy into sport. Naruto wasn't alone for long. A woman with a war fan as wide as her shoulders and a gaze like a measuring tool paced toward him with 2 guards in her wake. She had hair like all the colors of dry grass and a presence that folded space to fit her. The guards watched the crowd, not him. She watched him. Leaf Shinobi, she said. We expected one team. We got you in a weapons cart. Konoha's priorities confuse me. Tenten's paperwork is mightier than a platoon, Naruto said. He didn't hide the grin. I'm Naruto. Tamari of the Sand. She didn't offer a hand. She offered the faintest tilt of chin, respect scaled to fit distance. You're the one with the bridge. It's not mine, he said. I just didn't let it fall down. That's one definition of ownership. Her eyes flicked to his strange scabbard and away. No stare, just a note. We're trading glass and grain today. Konoha asked me to make sure no one embarrasses anyone else. Is that an official duty? It's the only duty anyone remembers. The bazaar flexed around them as a caravan eased through. Temari stepped sideways before it needed to be a collision. The movement as natural as wind finding a new path. Naruto had the small, stupid thought that his body already knew how to move next to hers, then shoved it under a rug and sat on it. He found himself liking the rug. A drunk mercenary stumbled out of a stall 3 breaths later like the scene had been waiting for him. He wore piecemeal armor and breath like bad vinegar and had a sword shaped like a question mark about bad decisions. He tripped into Naruto's space with the clumsy confidence of men who expected the world to make way because it usually did. "Hey," he said, trying to find a face to be angry at. Watch where you're standing." Naruto didn't move. He watched the man's shoulders and the angle of his hips and the tired way his weapon rested. He didn't feel threatened, he felt impatient. A few heads turned with that anticipatory hunger crowds kept in their pockets. Maybe there would be a story to eat later. Temari's fan wasn't open, but the way she held it made room. "We can handle this without being boring," she murmured. "You want the honors, Leaf. Trade you for something interesting after," Naruto said. He didn't even need to reach for Ukifune. The mercenary's weight fell onto his front foot at an angle that predicted a telegraphed slash. Naruto let him start it, watched the numbers line up, and then cut the air in front of the blade with 2 quiet movements that weren't meant for steel at all, they were meant for wind. It hugged his edge and went thin and behaved. He made 1 precise slice that didn't touch the mercenary's sword and then a second that didn't touch his shirt. The wind he'd shaped puffed out the cloth at the shoulder and the hilt guard, turned the man's swing, and made it feel like he'd changed his mind mid-motion. The sword ended up down and away from anyone that mattered. Temari's fan snapped open with a sound that made 2 children clap. She stroked air that had been shouting and made it go quiet, tamping the dust into a neat ring around the mercenary's boots. A scolding in sand. Naruto's cut and her gust made a halo that didn't touch the onlookers. Glass chimes kept singing. The drunk blinked at his weapon as though betrayed by physics. "Go home," Temari said. "Not unkind. Hydrate. Apologize to your joints in the morning." The mercenary nodded like her instructions were the only water in the desert and lurched off toward shade. People resumed pretending not to have watched. Naruto and Temari shared a look whose edges stepped over flirtation and landed in the far more dangerous field of mutual respect. "Nice hands," she said. "Nice wind," he answered. A woman in plain clothes who had been part of the crowd without being in it stepped forward and touched Naruto's scabbard with 2 fingers, adjusting the hang by an inch. "If you start a draw from that angle, you're going to fight your own elbow," she said, voice pitched low, not for secrecy but for kindness. "Better." Naruto felt the correction in his bones. He turned to her with the elastic reflex of someone who had learned to be grateful without turning the gratitude into a debt. She wore her hair tied back with nothing fancy and eyes that had learned 1,000 ways to count exits. "Thanks," he said. "Naruto. Yugao." The slight nod carried months' worth of quiet. "I'm just watching." Temari's mouth tilted a fraction. "Konoha always just watches, with a blade tucked in the shadow, "Only when it's bright," Yugao said. The smile didn't reach her eyes. It wasn't meant to. Tenten shouldered in with a stamped sheath and a ribbon of official string. "We're cleaned and blessed. Don't get us unblessed before I sell at least 2 crates of throwing needles, or I will haunt you both." "Border's yours," Temari said. "Just don't rearrange our stalls to fit your Leaf aesthetics." "You say that like my aesthetics aren't superior," Tenten sniffed. "Watch me arrange a table with symmetry that could end wars." She did. She made a rectangle into a promise and a row of tools into an argument. Naruto drifted the way one does when you're not shopping but your feet know where the fight is going to start. Yugao drifted with him 1 pace behind and to the left. Temari took her place on a small rise with line of sight on 3 streets and the kind of posture that made trouble reconsider its route. It hit anyway. The first sign was a bell that no one rang. The second was a woman lifting her son and then pausing mid-motion like someone had swapped him for a basket while she blinked. The third was the way the air went clean around 4 people in white. They didn't look like priests. Priests looked like they wanted your attention. These looked like they wanted the space between your breaths. Their white robes were the kind that were justified in being white even on a bad day. A sigil like a crescent with a bite missing sat pale on their sleeves. And the lines, chalk pale, bone bright, unfurled from hidden reels and slid through the bazaar like low, well-mannered fog. Children stopped mid-chase. A man dropped a clay jug and watched it shatter without surprise. A girl looked up at the older boy she'd been holding hands with and took her fingers back like alien things. The crowd didn't scream. They didn't know what to be scared of. Naruto's jaw tightened. He felt the urge to bite Ukifune and went with it. The weight at his teeth put his head where it needed to be. Breath took its number. Tenten. He snapped, already moving. Tarps high, ropes low. Make walls where I turn. She didn't ask which way. She rolled over her counter without both. Ring the neatness and grabbed 2 poles and a cloth with the speed of a street magician. Yugao was already stepping into a chalk line's path, eyes on the wrist that fed it, not the line itself. Tamari lifted her fan. The first band slid toward a group of travelers bundled in desert white. Naruto didn't try to block it head-on. He cut a small angle into the air and let the line fall into the triangle. He made 2 quiet slices with his hand blades, Ukifune anchoring his posture. The wind obeyed the geometry. The band dipped, momentarily finding nothing to sever, and touched the ground with a hiss that left a chalk scar. Corridors. Naruto shouted, mind clicking into place like shogi pieces landing. Make them look like alleys. 1 way out, 3 ways in. Tamari read him perfectly. She blew a controlled gust along the rows of blankets and smokers and tables, her fan turning chaos into lanes you could survive. Dust rose where she wanted and stayed flat where she didn't. Tenten tied a tarp corner to a nail with a throw that had no business being that accurate, then pinned the other edge with a weight that flattened a coil of severance line to the deck long enough for 3 people to step over it. Yugao's knife appeared in her hand and then in the soft flesh under a white shrine acolyte's jaw and then in her hand again, sheathing itself like it had only gone out to make a point. The line on his reel slackened and he looked surprised, not at the blood, but at the loss of tension. The bands weren't physical and they were. Naruto had learned to live in that kind of contradiction. Clones did that to a person. He moved low where the lines moved high, high where they slid for ankles. He never let his breath get clever. 4 on the draw, 2 on the step, 1 on the cut. He took a A's on the shoulder at the edge of where Kurama lived and went cold at the absence, but it held, stuttering, not gone. He planted Ukifune into a timber post without hesitation, used the flex in the wood as a spring to vault over a low band, and scissored both hand blades in a cut that wasn't intended to kill anyone. It bit the reel at its axle and turned the line into a useless snake in a heartbeat. Tamari kept pace without needing to see him. Her gusts found his wakes and made them useful, a hand on his back at the right moment, a pressure on his hip that nudged him into a safe angle. The 2 of them drew a shape in the bazaar, a set of bending corridors with teeth at both ends and a safe throat for civilians to be pushed down. Tenten's thrown anchors made corners where there were none a moment before. Yugao stayed in the shadows of the busiest routes and took the heads off the worst decisions with surgical timing. Left, Tenten shouted once, because she could see an angle even Naruto couldn't. He went left. A band that had been looking for Temari's wrist found a crate corner instead and took it in 2. The crate's contents, bundles of dry reeds, went up and out in a brittle whisper. A white, robed figure at the far end raised a bell striker, the kind Naruto had cut for before, and found his hands full of air the next breath because Temari's fan had taken the sound out of the world where he needed it. He swung anyway, and it was small and sad. The severance pulse shuddered and died like a cough. People began to understand where safety was. They flowed into the corridors Naruto made and Tamari illuminated and Tenten maintained and Yugao kept clean. They shouted names to each other and, mostly, remembered them. Mostly, the man in white who mattered stood under the shade of the northern tower. Away from the immediate work. He wore a hat with a brim that made its own shadow even when the light didn't feel like obeying. He touched nothing. The lines moved anyway. He was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful, which is to say not much until it moves and then too much. Naruto felt the look and turned, and their eyes met across air that had been argued with by 4 different people in a desert. Polite. The man lifted his hand, the gesture tiny as a breath. A clean slice moved through what Naruto had made. He didn't feel it in his body. He felt it when a boy and a girl who had been gripping each other at the corridor's throat looked down at their hands like they were holding unfamiliar tools. The girl took a step back. The boy laughed a little, confused, and stopped because he didn't know why he'd started. Someone screamed then, not because of this, but because that's what panic uses as catalyst. The scream was ugly. Naruto's mouth filled with copper. He went. He didn't sprint. Sprints were honest and easy to read. He moved with the small, rude steps that got you across knife rooms. Ukifune bit his teeth lightly enough to remind him not to clench. He breathed. The man in white tilted his head the subtlest fraction. A white band, child thin, came low at an angle that would take Naruto's ankle bone to Konoha and shake his first day at the academy out of his bones. Naruto cut nothing. He put his foot where the cut wasn't and lifted with a breath and let the band pass under a heel that had been there a moment before and wasn't now. A second band reached for his mouth. He smiled with his eyes and opened them wider. It slid over the line where steel met teeth and found no purchase. Ukifune's wind sheath hummed at the limit of hearing. It probably thought it was being funny. He closed on the man in white and found he didn't want to cut him. Not because of mercy, because of precision. This man was a hand, not a cause. The cause smelled like cold chalk and warm paper. It was elsewhere, so Naruto cut his lines. He made it small and boring, and the man hated it because it took away the aesthetic of his gesture. "Who are you?" Naruto asked, not for the name, for the shape it made in a mouth. The man took the words in like a host tasting a dish before offering it. "Warden," he said. It fit too easily. "Hakucho, if you must." "What are you doing to these people?" Naruto said, and then cut the band that tried to take the question away. "Tidying," Hakucho said. "The world is a tangle. I make it kind." Temari's fan cracked the air right then and Ust sent a shimmer of heat between them like a mirage. The warden didn't blink. He lifted 2 fingers. Somewhere to Naruto's right, a mother stared at her child and didn't place his face again. She's so BBED without moving because her body remembered something her head didn't. Naruto's anger came in like a tide. He put his feet in the sand and let it hit his ankles and made sure it didn't knock him down. He did not swing. He did not let his voice get heroic. He did something he knew how to do. He made a choice and forced it into the next 5 breaths. "Tenten," he said, not raising his voice. "Beck. Ah's voice volume was how you wasted cuts. You're sharpest. Tie me something mean to the end of this." He flicked a hand back. Tenten didn't ask what this was. She looped a wire around his offhand blade's pommel and pulled it tight twice. The kind of knot that scouts used to hang food away from bears. "Don't fall in love with it," she said. "You'll be cheating on your sword. Already in a complicated relationship," he said, and swung. He didn't swing the blade at the warden. He swung it at a line anchor set in the tower's mortar at a polite height. The wire Tenten had tied sang. It caught the band like a strand of spiderweb catching dust and turned it, not into a toy, that would be too easy, but into something he could predict. He pulled. The anchor popped. Stone dust fell. The band collapsed like a lung deflating. Hakucho watched the stone flake fall through wind. He seemed almost pleased. "You were untidy, Naruto," he murmured like someone reading a nicely made threat. "I will remember you. Remembering is my thing," Naruto said, but the words tasted wrong in the moment because he could feel holes in the crowd's story already. A couple stood with their hands near each other, not touching and not knowing how to. 2 old men argued in voices that didn't know what they were angry about. A child asked for a different mother in a high, embarrassed voice so he wouldn't cry. Naruto had to pick. Run at the warden and make him cut some more in retreat, or stay and keep civilians from being tidied into loneliness. He didn't have a Zoro rule for that. He used his own. He chose people, not the satisfying cut. "Gate lanes," he barked. Out and through. Temari reached the idea mid-air and caught it. She folded wind into 3 neat corridors that pointed out of the bazaar and toward the shade of the checkpoint. Her guards took up positions with spears that had seen enough work to be trusted. They didn't try to arrest the shrine, they shepherded the living. Yugao shadowed the loss. T-line of the desperate and took a man's knees when he decided now was the right time to steal. Her knife didn't reflect on anyone. Naruto backed the crowd out with his blades never fully out of their homes. A farmer with a switch and a smile that told stubborn cattle where the fence was. He kept his eyes on the warden and the warden kept his on Naruto and nothing moved that didn't need to. Hakuchi. O lifted his hand once more and cut a single bond somewhere with the casual intimacy of someone who knows exactly where to put the knife. He didn't do it to Naruto. He did it to the corridor, to show he could. Then he nodded to himself like a craftsman noticing a nick in a table he planned to sand later. Another day, he said, as though he'd been forced to cancel a pleasant meeting. He and his wife did not run. They withdrew. The air unknotted itself a fraction, reluctantly. The bazaar breathed different now, a little off, like a jaw you'd slept on wrong. Naruto stood long enough to count his breath back to normal. He unsnapped the wire from his hilt and coiled it without looking. Tenten took it from him and put it away in a pouch that had more traps than a street vendor's smile. Temari came down from her vantage and didn't bother to hide the anger under her skin. It made the air near her a little hotter. She looked at the people first. A boy and a girl who didn't know how to look at each other now. A mother who had her child back in her arms and a face full of lightning after. A merchant rearranging his wares like a prayer. Then she looked at Naruto. That, she said, lo, is not happening here again. Agreed, he said. Which means, she continued, that when you go after them, I'm not sending a report and waiting for 3 signatures and an argument in the council chamber. I'm coming. We're not a team. Yugao said softly. Temari's eyes cut to her. There was weight in that look. Then fix that. Yugao met it without blinking. I am Anbu, she said, the first time she'd used the word aloud where it could be caught by anyone careless enough to be close. She let it sit, and I will not let this city become a training ground for their god. We move off civilian streets when we fight. We build redundancies. We do not improvise when we can plan. If you can live with that, sand, then yes. Fix it. Temari's mouth tugged like she might smile in a year. I can live with that. Tenten shouldered between them with 2 paper cups and the brittle kind of humor that made people keep breathing. I can live with both of you if you drink this. It's technically tea. We are technically fine. Naruto took a cup and found it tasted like herbs and heat in an argument about sugar. He drank anyway. He watched the warden's afterimage evaporate from the edge of the plaza and realized the man had left something behind. Not a mistake. Not arrogance. A calling card. It wasn't obvious. He only saw it because Temari lifted her fan to dust it off and her fingers paused on the rib. Something white had been tucked into the case where the silk folded back. A paper charm, blank at first glance, folded on itself 3 times and sealed with a bead of wax the color of milk. She went to flick it away on instinct and then stopped. Don't touch it, Naruto said, both hands empty of blades on purpose. Temari frowned. It's just paper. Nothing that's just anything hums like that. Tenten's voice had gone technical. She produced a thin pair of tongs from nowhere good and plucked the charm out, dropping it into a small clay jar that had a smear of something sealing the inside. We will poke this together. Temari's fingers lingered on the empty spot it had warmed. She rubbed the skin like she could erase the feeling. It was warm. She didn't sound unnerved. She sounded insulted. Yugao's eyes had gone a strange shade of distant. He can place his will where we keep our tools. She blinked, closed the expression away, and became just a woman with tired shoulders again. We'll set a perimeter tonight. No one sleeps alone. Is that the rule? Temari asked. That's the wisdom. Yugao's smile was small and vicious. Rules can be broken. They worked until the sun softened and the glass sang lower. They didn't leave. They rearranged. Tenten made her stall into a depot. Temari's guards adjusted their routes into patterns that made it harder to draw straight lines through public space. Yugao stood in shadow and watched until watching turned into a kind of prayer. Naruto moved, blade sheathed, reminding people how to walk out of shock by walking next to them. He didn't say pretty things. He said names and he said them right, and that helped more than any speech. When the bazaar stopped shaking, they took the long way around to a dune that caught the evening wind like a cupped hand. The moon you get in wind isn't the same as the moon you get in wave. It's drier, a bone lifted to the sky by something that knows how to clean a carcass. Naruto sat with his DS across his lap and his jaw still sore from biting the day into manageable pieces. The others made a loose half-circle. The clay jar with the charm sat in the center like a rude guest. Temari spoke first because someone had to. "I don't do debts," she said. "But I do respect. You pulled strangers into lanes that let them live. We combine that with protocol and we have a road worth walking." She tipped her chin toward the charm. "We also have a problem that thinks it's a solution." "I've punched worse solutions," Tenten said. "Not this kind," Yugao murmured. Her fingers traced shapes on the sand without drawing anything. "He doesn't want blood. He wants the husk blood leaves behind." Naruto's thumb ran along Ukifun's Suba. He measured his breath without counting. "We'll move before he picks the time. Land of Iron is closest route if we want steel that won't go quiet around his toys. There's a smith there who takes promises personally." Temari quirked an eyebrow. "You say that like you've met her." "Haven't yet." He looked at the dunes. "But I've met the kind of person she probably is." Temari studied him. "You plan loud," she said. "But you fight quiet." "I learned to stop lying to my hands," he said. The rest followed. Silence grew. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that happens after a near miss when everyone can finally hear their own lungs. The wind worried the top of the dune into patterns like script a god had started and lost interest in finishing. "Those two at the gate," Temari said at last, not looking at him, watching the slope where their shadows pooled. "The ones who stopped holding hands. They came to me after. Asked if there was a form you filled out to ask for what they forgot." Her mouth did something almost human and then rested. "I told them to try the tea stall and 2 tables to the left. That's where they met, the first time." Naruto exhaled. "Did it help?" Temari let the sand trickle through her fingers in a thin stream. "It will," she said. "Or it won't. There are days when being a diplomat is just being willing to lie to the future and call it courage." Yugao made a soft sound that might have been approval. "You stayed on E Street when you could have gone to write this up. Your Hokage will get her lines," Temari said dryly. "But I won't stand at a desk while something cuts my village into tidier pieces." Naruto looked over. "So that's a yes." "It's a yes with conditions." Temari ticked them on the edge of her fan. "We use my win to shape our battles, not just to impress people. We don't pretend we're not making politics every time we breathe. And if you get heroic and stupid, I hit you with this." "I'm remarkably easy to hit with rules," Naruto said, a little grin chasing the worst of the day out of his mouth. Tenten raised her cup again. "To not being tidy." Yugao didn't drink. She tipped the cup and let a ribbon of tea darken the sand in front of the jar. "To remembering." They sat until the moon climbed. Ed and the cold chased the heat like lovers who never quite catch each other. When the wind shifted, the clay jar clicked softly as if settling. Temari reached for it out of reflex and stopped, remembering. Her hand hovered, then fell. "Tomorrow we move," Naruto said, because the night had given them as much thinking as it meant to. "Iron," then back on Hakucho's throat until he coughs up whoever taught him to slice the world that way. Tenten leaned back on her elbows and stared up like she meant to pick a star and argue it into a better position. "You have a way with motivational speeches, you know that." "I'm cutting them down," he said. Yugao let the ghost of a smile happen. "No wasted words. It suits you." Temari rose, dusted sand off her skirt with a sharp swipe, and slid her fan into its case. Her fingers brushed the place where the charm had been and she stilled. The skin there was still warmer than the rest of her hand. She glanced down into the jar. The charm lay folded like a quiet thought. No glow, no hum, nothing to offer the casual glance. "We burn it tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," Naruto agreed. He yawned then. Nothing noble about it, and covered it with the back of his wrist like a boy sneaking in late. Tenten snickered. Yugao pretended not to notice. Temari's mouth did the thing again where it almost smiled and then remembered there were people watching. They bedded down in overlapping shifts. No one slept alone. Tenten's alarm stitched the dune's crest with invisible teeth. Yugao sat with her back to the jar like a dare. Temari slept with the fan across her middle. Fingers curled in the ribbon. Naruto lay on his side, 3 blades wrapped in cloth and intent a hand's reach away, and counted the breath in his jaw until the numbers made sense again. He Dreamed of wind running along steel and of someone's hand finding his forearm in a crowd and not letting go because there was no need to, because the need had been cut out of the world and they were putting it back. The desert cooled. The bazaar below murmured into a new life, different but stubborn. Somewhere at the edge of the border, a man in white walked a line he could feel under his feet and hummed a song with no words. He would have called it tidying. Naruto would have another word for it when he found him next. Morning took its time. When it arrived, it smelled like dust and tea and so. Mething warm in a clay jar that didn't belong to any of them. They would burn it. They would move. They would hit iron until it sang. Chapter 2 end. Chapter 3. Iron sings, shadows answer. They burned tea. He charm at dawn because everything ugly looks smaller with sun on it. Temari held the jar. Tenten worked the tongs. Yugao set the little clay brazier with hands that had buried friends and evidence in equal measure. Naruto didn't say anything. He fed the first spark. The folded paper turned its clean face to the flame and refused for one heartbeat. Then the wax bead softened and the heat found the seam. The paper lit without drama. No scream. No smell except warmed milk and a sour note like chalk taking offense. The ash rose and scattered when Temari's fan moved, no bigger than a moth deciding on a second flight. It wanted to stay, Tenten said softly. Too bad. Let's keep it that way, Temari answered, the ribbon of her fan catching ash and sky both. Iron. Then, the road tilted colder with every hour. Wind traded sand for knives. Frost crawled up the edges of puddles and tried on a dozen shapes before deciding ice was the cleanest. By the time they crossed into the land of iron proper, the breath left Naruto's lips like steam and the ground did not remember summer. His jaw ached in new ways. Cold did that. It made you honest with your teeth. He liked it. The iron village sat, with its back to mountains that hadn't moved in any story. Forge smoke made the air thick in a way that felt like work, not sickness. Hammers rang, not in synchronized bravado, but as if every anvil here had its own heartbeat and they agreed on pace without needing a conductor. The woman who met them at the main forge didn't wear a name on her face, but the apprentices said, Master, like it came with splinters. She had burned scars like continents mapping both forearms, and eyes that could spot a crooked line across a courtyard in a blizzard. You brought metal that hums, she said to Naruto as if commenting on mud tracked on her floor. And work in your shoulders you haven't named yet. Naruto didn't bristle. He took the ingot from Tenten's cart and set it on the anvil the way you put a sleeping child down, careful. But without ceremony that would embarrass the thing being cared for. It wants to become something that answers me when I'm out of words, he said, because the cold and the ringing made lying feel expensive. The master's mouth tilted. Steel answers the hand, not the mouth. You want a sword or a prayer wheel. Something I can use to tell the truth faster, Naruto said. She considered him the briefest second longer than polite. Then she pointed at the apprentices. Vows. They lined up without rolling their eyes. They faced the rack of blanks and billets and the oil. Dark quenched trough and spoke in the sing-song rhythm of people who had learned to respect the foolish power of repeating a thing out loud. Steel breaks liars, they said. Steel keeps what you give it. We will not ask for what we won't carry. We will not promise with empty hands. Tenten mouthed the last line in time with them, not mockery, just muscle memory from 100 visits to 100 shish. Ops that liked to pretend iron didn't remember who struck it. The master's eye caught hers and catalogued the stance, the finger calluses, the way she shifted weight when someone else's hammer fell. Quote, you know which end of the tongs is the bite, the master said. I know which end of a person is the bite, Tenten said, cheerfully venomous. Show me your channel plan and I'll show you how not to get anyone's face cut off by a wire that thinks it's a god. That earned a laugh from one of the apprentices that tried to be a cough. The master didn't discourage it. She turned to Naruto and put her thumb on the ingot like a stethoscope. It hums like wind in a hollow, she said. Good. I'll make two. One to cut the air thin. One to hold a storm without breaking. You will help or you will leave. No watching with clean hands. Deal, Naruto said. They were in it then. Not montage. Just the kind of work that makes your knuckles feel like you shook hands with an honest enemy and both of you lived. Tenten dropped into the forge rhythm like she'd been hoarding breath for this. She and the master argued metal like two cooks swearing at the same soup. Their words were by tea, but the steam smelled right. Tamari stood by with a fan that made air go where ash wasn't welcome. Yugao watched the door with her back to it and her eyes on the floor pattern. Naruto took the hammer when given and learned the master's pace, not hard. Then harder, not proud, then sheepish, just right, then again. They folded the first billet until the line in it started to look like wind had left fingerprints. They folded the second until it looked like lightning had had a thought and decided to stay. The master marked them with chalk and then with faint, careful cuts a child might have called spider writing. Tent. Etched seal lines where she wanted wind to flow and severance to fail, little grooves along the spine that would hold thin lacquer later. She made a mouthpiece grip that was not an afterthought and would not break teeth. She held it up for Naruto's inspection and waggled it. Look, she said, I made a chew toy. Naruto took it like a solemn ceremony and then bit it. His jaw settled, his shoulders released a fraction. You're ruining me, he said around it. You were already ruined, Tenten said. She tapped the billet that heard lightning. I'm just putting handles on it. The master looked at Naruto when the billets had been drawn long and the edge geometry lived in the steel and heat had erased 10 wrong choices. What do you ask them to do? She said, hands quiet, that your hands can't. He didn't throw back a clever line. He tasted metal in the air and his own breath in his mouth and the way wind liked to curl around the forge door. Temari's fan clicked closed, a small sound. Yugao shifted her stance. He could hear the leather. Tenten's eyes. He didn't look, because looking made lies happen. Hold the promises I can't keep yet, he said. Until I catch up. The master nodded once, a smith's amen. Good. We'll quench when the light is wrong. He didn't know what that meant until the mountain's shadow slid across the yard and the forge light changed from hot to holy. The Aster lifted the first blade with both hands the way you lift a question you're afraid of and lowered it into the quench. The oil hissed. The sound wasn't violent. It sounded like relief that had been waiting a long time. She drew it out and the blade remembered being straight. It also remembered the wind lines Tenten's channels had invited into it. It cooled true. Shinkas, the master said, as if telling the steel something about its own character. Naruto set the mouthpiece to his teeth without drawing and felt his spine click into place like a door on the right hinge. The second blade took longer to decide to be born. When it slid into oil it fought a little, curved options refusing to be told which one they were allowed. The master's scarred hands did not waver, they supported without forcing. When the blade came up, it was deeper through the spine and rang, not like Shinkazi's tiny voice, but like a struck bell in a small temple. Thunder needs a name that doesn't lie, the master murmured. Narukami. Naruto took them both with the careful greed of a starving man offered soup and a seat. He stood there and felt 2 promises become weight. He felt the breath he'd promised to the ocean migrate down into his feet. You're not done, the master said, because smiths don't let a man stand in a quiet moment without making it hurt a little. You have to learn how to keep what you asked for. He didn't ask how. They had a frozen lake for that. They hiked above the village to a bowl in the pines the wind had kept for itself. The lake under the bowl had a skin as thick as the season. Snow found the edges and settled. The air was so cold that breath forgot to be dramatic and just got to the business of keeping a person alive. Yugao produced blindfolds like a magic trick a bored murderer would do at a party. Offense makes noise, she said. Silence is work. Amayuri arrived midway through Yugao's lecture by stepping out of a tree line like she'd always been standing there. Twin swords riding her hips like wolves that had decided not to bite anyone yet. Her gray hair stuck to her cheek. She didn't notice or didn't care. Lightning cracked along one blade's edge with the bored fuss of a cat groomed too much. Tell me you're not teaching him to be polite, she said. I teach him to live, Yugao said. Same thing if you do it right, Amayuri said, and smiled with too many teeth to be civilized. She didn't offer to shake hands. She hooked a thumb toward the swords at Naruto's hips. You going to show me what those do, or do I have to be disappointed? Tenten leaned toward Tamari. You made a friend. I made a problem that likes us, Tamari said. We'll take it. Naruto tied the blindfold and let the world become souls and snow in the air on the back of his neck. He put Ukifune to his teeth because that had become the way to tell his body the drill had begun. Shinka's in his right hand felt like a breath he wasn't done with. Narukami in his left felt like a cloud thinking about lightning. Yugao's footsteps found his circle, not heavy, not soft, true. She wasn't going to put him on ice to watch him die. She was going to put him on ice because he needed to learn to listen to it complain. 3 attackers, she said. You don't know from where. If you cut me or Tamari, I'll be cross. If you cut Tenten, she'll sell your fingers back to you. If you cut Amayuri, we'll have a new problem. Good, Amayuri said. I'm bored. Naruto stood there long enough to let silence make a map. He counted 4 paces to the hollow where the ice moaned, 8 to the wind. D break where a gust scolded itself on rock. 1 heartbeat to the cold web where a breath he knew, Tamari, stayed steady and intentional. Tenten's faint jingle of a hidden ring. Yugao's almost nothing. Amayuri's tiny, impatient crackle like a thundercloud swearing under its breath. Ready, Naruto said. They came in not to kill him, but to teach him how to not die interestingly. Temari's wind nudged first, a lie about where the threat would be. He let it pretend to move him and then didn't let it. Tenten's throw made a sound like a handshake and he lifted Shinka's to cut a noise, not metal. Snow whispered in a new direction. He stepped there. The ice creaked a syllable. The first blade touched his left like a flirty insult. He turned Narukami a hair and let it kiss the attacking edge and lean. The second threat wasn't a blade. It was weight. Yugao, entering his guard with the politeness of a ghost. He bent at the hip and felt the mouthpiece anchor his head. Ukifune's spine caught his teeth. His body held. He didn't see Amayuri's blade. No one saw Amayuri's blade when she didn't want them to. He heard the air a finger width before it would have parted him and cut nothing, just lifted a foot and placed it on a piece of ice that would crack if he put pride on it. He didn't. He let the crack happen, gentle, and used its song to place a phantom. The clone took his weight like a brother. It shifted his shadow half a breath left. He hadn't practiced this exact thing. His body had been waiting for it anyway. His right hand didn't swing Shinka's, it walked her across a line only he could feel. The sound she made wasn't steel on steel or air on air. It was a third thing. For a blink, Naruto stood in his own afterimage. Another him moved where he had been, blade held at an angle Yugao had slapped into him at the bridge. Amayuri's strike cut through that ghost and hissed at empty honesty. Her mouth flash smiled inside the crackle. Ashura, she said, delighted, and went for the ray. Him as if she could earn the word out loud. He slid a breath to the left and let the phantom take the insult. Ukifune bit his teeth. The posture held. They did it until the cold ate the edges off Ire fingers and Naruto's jaw stopped being in his face and took up residence in his ears. He kept finding places he'd been a heartbeat ago and leaving someone competent there. It wasn't a Bunshin trick exactly. It was footwork and clone timing and the admission that if you moved honestly, you could be in 2 memories at once. When he stripped the blindfold off, the world was the same and not. Chima, stood with hair blown out of its usual neat, cheeks bright from cold. Tenten had snow across her shoulders like confetti at a wedding where someone had forgotten to invite scents. Yugao had cut a hoe, lay in his ego without him noticing and was sewing it shut with thread made of approval. Amayuri had frost on her lashes and a grin that wanted blood in the good way. That, she said to Naruto, utterly satisfied, will get you praised by people I respect and murdered by people who need killing. Keep it. Name it something that reminds you not to be smug, Yugao advised. Naruto rolled the name in. His mouth where the mouthpiece had bruised him. Ashura afterimage. Amayuri nodded. It lies like a good story. I approve. They were halfway back to the forge when the bell rang. It didn't ring. Not to the ear. It rang in the space between people's names. Naruto felt it as a yanked thread under the breastbone, and then the village under the mountain seemed to exhale all at once and not breathe again for 3 long counts. The air went flat. Snow that had been falling looked embarrassed to be seen. The sound of hammers dimmed like a bar where someone had walked in and turned all the jokes mean. Naruto's steps went faster without announcing it. He didn't tell the others to hurry. Their bodies had already told their legs. They hit the main street at a run. The veil wasn't a color, but if You had to give it one, it would have been the shade of paper left out of the sun. Naruto saw it draped across windows and laid over doorways, the way fog sits on water and decides to be skin. People ed under it like they were underwater in air. A father with a plank under his arm walked past his own home. Naruto knew it was his. There were toys by the door he had built badly and loved fiercely, and went 3 houses down. Set the plank in a room that had never belonged to his son, and smiled to himself in a way that made Naruto feel the shape of a wound. Tenten's voice lost its joke. Lines, she said. Find where it's fed. Yugao's hand landed on Naruto's sleeve and pressed until he met her eyes. Bell ringer, she said. Always. Cut the bell and you stop the second pulse. Tamari was hour 80 moving on a street that had been designed badly and used well. Her fan flipped and set controlled wind-down alleys that were supposed to keep snow from drowning doorways. She guided it toward a small shrine at the village's throat. The little bells at its corners didn't move, the air around them did. Not good. Naruto felt the veil lick at his ankles and he stepped sideways. Shinka's came up humming thin as a headache. Narukami hummed lower, as if holding back a cough. Ukifune found his teeth. He didn't set rules in his head. He put them in his breath. 4 on the draw, 2 on the step, 1 on the cut. It kept him from doing the wrong kind of brave. The first white shrine team had set up neat as a surgeon's tray in the square by the shrine. Their reels looked colder than the snow. The Hulk pale bands that came off them laced through the veil like reinforcement, not its source. The anchor had to be in the shrine itself. A paper C inside a wooden box, a bell striker that thought it was a quiet god's tongue. Tamari. She felt the command in her spine the moment before he said it and had already opened her fan for a narrow gust that would make smoke think it was wind and wind think it was smoke. Tenten's boots hit the snow without a squeak, seals between her fingers like a dealer who cheated for you and made you feel good about it. Yugao was gone in the way she was when she wanted someone to die without an audience. Naruto went straight at the reels to make the white shrine look at him and not at the door of the shrine where Yugao slid like shadow. A chalk band slithered, for his chest like an insult whispered to a crowd. He met it with Shinka's not as a block but as a stern conversation. The wind sheath around the blade made a wedge without moving the tip much. The B, and slid off it wrong and was suddenly a line looking for home with no map. He cut it when it looked most lost. 2 more came and he moved inside their idea of a triangle. His jaw hurt. He didn't mind. The mouthpiece kept his head honest. He cut fewer things than he wanted to. No wasted cuts. Left. Tenten called once. He pivoted, Narukami coming up at a polite angle to turn aside a band aimed at Temari's wrist. The offhand blade took the glance and held. He felt it in his elbow and his teeth. Lightning kissed his edge. Amayuri didn't shout enter, didn't pose, she simply stepped into his flank, swords already singing. And let her blades graze Narukami with a whisper that left the steel buzzing. He felt the charge travel through the thick spine and into the seals Tenten had etched along it. They woke, not with light, but with a different way of remembering energy. Narukami held what she was given and didn't let it bite the wrong person. Amayuri grinned, eyebrows up like a child who had just realized the strange boy had a pocketful of fireworks. Oh, he likes me. Don't make it weird, Tenten said, but her eyes were bright. The bell pulse was coming. Naruto felt it as a yawn in the world's face. He planted Ukifune between his teeth and handed his offhand to Amayuri by not looking at her and trusting she would be there to take what he offered. She was. Temari's gusts had sculpted the square into a funnel. The veil tried to be everywhere, but wind had opinions. The 2 of them turned air into a path that headed right for the shrine door. Yugao, Naruto said to the air. 2 breaths. Came the velvet reply from a place his eyes couldn't agree existed. On your count. He set the count in his jaw, not his mouth. He lifted Shinka's and layered a sliver of wind over Narukami's held lightning. Amayuri didn't need a signal. She had been married to thunder longer than Naruto had been in love with wind. She brought her blade down, not to cut the bell ringer, though she could have, but to lay the charge into Narukami the way you hand someone a torch and expect them not to drop it. Naruto moved through the space between the band supports like a man late to a train who knows exactly how much time he has to be a genius. The white shrine acolytes reached for their lines. Tenten nailed 2 of the reels to the deck with chain bolts that she must have magicked from thin air, Naruto would ask later and be lied to. Affectionately, the wind corridor hugged him, Temari's hand invisible at his back. He and Amayuri crossed their blades at the foot of the shrine with a sound like cloth tearing. Wind Thunder Crosscut wasn't named then, it didn't need to be. 2 edges made for different truths agreed to speak at once. The bolt that left that crossing didn't arc. It went in a straight line, polite and final. It cut the veil's anchor the way a clean, honest question can make a liar laugh because he was planning to be found out anyway. Inside the shrine, something sighed like paper relieved of duty. The air came back in a rush that tasted like people, not glue. Yugao stepped out behind the bell ringer and let him sit down forever. He didn't bleed onto anything important. Shish. He wiped her blade on a piece of wood no one would miss. The veil didn't tear, it unhooked itself from whatever it had convinced of its necessity and slid off. A man to Naruto's right looked up from say, Tting a bowl in a little boy's room that did not exist in his house and frowned and then curled around his sigh and cried into his hands. Someone laughed and it didn't sound like a dropped plate. The cold went back to being simple. Naruto rested his blades without sheathing. He waited for the second pulse and it didn't come. He closed his eyes and let his jaw unclench, once, carefully. Move, Tenten said a beat later. Too calm to be anything but serious. There's a wagon at the north road with lines hooked to its wheels. They were going to run a test on it while the veil held. Test, Amayuri said like a curse. They ran. The north road curved under pines that had learned to bend without snapping. The wagon sat half off a ditch as if someone had meant to hide it and discovered time was a thing after all. Reels mounted on its sides had been set to play out when the wheels turned. Tenten's chain bolt lanced out and punched the hub like it had offended her. The wheel froze. A woman inside. The cage shot to her feet like a dog hearing keys. Red hair, Uzumaki red, escaped a hood that wasn't meant to keep a person warm. She had manacles on wrists that had seen worse. Her mouth twisted with the kind of humor that keeps rage from spilling. Her eyes hit Naruto like a seasoned censor reaching for a signature that lives in your bones. Oh, she said, the sarcasm melting at the edges. That's loud. The chains, Naruto asked, already moving. You, she said, and the chains. Yes, both. Then, because everything had been an emergency for days, she shrugged her hands at him like, what are we doing, a formal introduction. Karen, I was with, never mind who I was with. The white laundry stole me on a road where they shouldn't have known my name. Naruto set Shinka's Dao, and because you didn't cut bonds with a blade in hand unless the problem called for it. He took the manacle chain in both hands and listened to it with his breath. It wasn't clever, it was complicated. He pulled once and watched the pin holding the hinge learn it didn't want to anymore. He let go. Move your wrists, he said. Please. She did. He pulled again and the pin came out with a tired soldier's sigh. The cuff fell. She stared at it, then at him, then at his face like she'd been planning to make a joke and had to cancel because the punchline got shy. Thanks, she said, too quiet to be her default. You're bleeding, Tenten said, not to frighten, simply to give Karen something to do that wasn't crash. She was at Kareem's side with a bandage as if she'd teleported. Sit, drink, complain in alphabetical order. Karen sat, because smart people sit when told after a bad day. She drank. She didn't complain, which told Naruto as much as if she had. Can you find where the veil would sit if they try again? Temari asked her. It wasn't a test. It was trust offered in a technical voice. Karen rubbed her wrists, eyes half-lidded like listening was a posture. There's scaffolding. Not the wooden kind. The feeling kind. They push bands along it and the god. She stopped herself with a visible will. The idea they worship, feeds. If you make a spiral there instead of a grid, you can starve it. Or give it a stomachache. I like stomachaches. I like you, Tenten said. Karen managed a grin. That's because you're smart. Stop flirting with my mechanic, Temari said automatically, which made Tenten bark laugh. Yugao's mouth did the tiniest not smile. They skinned the wagon for parts and secrets. Tenten collected real guts with the care of someone intending to bully Steel into doing less harm. Amayuri, Having arrived at the limits of her interest in anything not immediately bleedable, leaned on a tree and cleaned her swords with the reverence some people reserved for small gods and foremothers. Narukami hummed faintly at her presence like a dog discovering a cousin. Temporary ally, Amayuri said out of nowhere to Naruto's shoulder. That's so, Naruto said. Until we both run out of reasons, she said. Then we'll see if we can stand each other anyway. He could. He didn't say it. She would have made it weird. They went back down with the wind scolding their cheeks and the village lurching toward a new normal. The master met them at the forge yard with a towel and no tolerance for poetry. You done with your outdoor killing? She asked. For now, Naruto said. Good. Bring me those blades. They need tempering. You need to stop grinning at them like they're kittens you stole. He didn't argue. He handed over Shinka's and Narukami and watched the master test the flex with thumbs that knew where to press. She nodded once at the give and then sent the blades into the tempering oven, heat softening yesterday's stubborn. She didn't ask about the veil. She had seen enough wars to know the shape without needing the verse. She looked at Naruto instead, the way a potter looks at a crack and decides whether to mend or to embrace. You answered correctly earlier, she said. Now carry it. He knew what she meant. Promises had weight even when no one watched. He took it into his jaw and hands and spine. The yard filled with night like steel cools under oil, steady, inevitable. Full of tiny sounds that only matter if you've been listening long enough to learn their names. The apprentices banked fires. Tenten fell asleep sitting up with her back against a crate, a wrench still in her hand like a teddy bear that could break your fingers. Tamari wrote 3 lines of something pragmatic in a scroll, then folded it and put it away like you put away the part of your heart that isn't needed for sleep. Yugao didn't pretend to slumber. She watched the gate with a calm that made younger men comforted and older ones uneasy. Karen found a corner with a blanket and the expression of someone who had always been resigned to cold and was surprised by warmth. Naruto leaned against the post where morning would hit and closed his eyes. Ukifune was at his hip, light, s. Hinkas and Narukami dozed red in the tempering oven, dreaming of edges. He let himself enjoy the weight of being here and not elsewhere, now and not then. Bonds thicken in the cold, a voice said, and the words didn't fog in the air. Naruto didn't start. He opened his eyes the way a person opens a door they already had their hand on. The man in white stood inside the forge yard as if the gate arranged itself to be behind him when he made up his mind to exist here. Snow thought about landing on his shoulder and didn't. He wore no hat now. His hair was the color of the absence of heat. His mouth was the kind of line a calligrapher gets praised for. His eyes were kind the way a man breaking a horse is kind. Hakucho held his hands respectfully at his sides. He was a guest at a meal he planned to ruin. Hello, Naruto, he said. Mild as warmed milk. I wanted to see which steel you chose to tell your truth. Naruto did not draw. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted iron and L. At the taste remind him he was an animal with a spine, not an idea. He said nothing. He held still. The warden looked past him at the temper oven as if checking to see whether the pieces fit the frame. He hummed, a tuneless thing. Pleased with the picture he'd made. Good, he said. This will be heavy enough to cut. Temari's fan whispered open behind Naruto's shoulder. Tenten's wrench slid off her lap without ringing. Yugao's knife took the knight's pulse. Karen didn't move. Her eyes opened and bled red a fraction, sensing chakra like a choir hearing the wrong note in a prayer. Naruto's jaw anchored. The forge heat licked his cheek. His breath counted itself. 4, 2, 1. We're closed, he said. Hakucho smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. Then let me see myself out, he said, and ached the smallest finger of his will into the yard as if testing which boards creaked. The temperature didn't change. The air did. It went thin between people the way ice goes thin near river mouths. Naruto watched it happen and felt the animal in him want to leap. He did not. No wasted cuts. Not yet. Bonds thicken in the cold, Hakucho repeated, almost tender. Let's start from what's strong. He lifted his hand. Chapter 3 end. Chapter 4. The empty sky and the cat's flame. Hakucho's hand lifted like a small courtesy. The forge yard thinned. Naruto tasted cold where breath should be and felt the quiet click of Temari's fan opening behind him. He didn't draw, not in a place that had given him steel and a second spine. He stepped sideways until the warden's line of sight found a wall instead of Tenten's sleeping shoulder. Yugao moved without sound to flank. Karen's eyes bled a patient red. "Move it," Naruto said, low. "Out of the yard." Hakucho's smile approved of the manners. "I prefer to work indoors," he said, and put his will under the yard like a board to pry at a floor. Naruto did something ugly with his feet that made polite swordsmen scoff and brawlers grin. He tapped the OV's brick with his heel, just enough to shift warmth into his jaw, the memory of heat into his breath. Temeri's wind smudged the edge of the warden's precision. Yugao stepped into the place a cut would want to land and offered it nothing. Tenten woke like a trap. No flinch, just movement. The warden's first band came low. Naruto cut it in the air with so little motion a jealous man would call it luck. He did not chase. He backed toward the open gate, making himself the gravity out there instead of the problem in here. Hakucho followed without hurry, rainless snow choosing to fall again now that fire and steel were behind them. "I don't want your dead on that anvil," Naruto said. "Pick stone." Hakucho inclined his head as if conceding a seat at table. "As you wish." They gave the yard back the master and took the fight to the street of snow and hammer smoke. Nothing got decided. Yugao made sure it couldn't. She appeared at a white sleeve when it mattered and touched a wrist where it would embarrass the band attached to it. Tenten made a line trip itself. Temari sent a measured blast that convinced the warden his angles weren't alone in the world. Karen counted the invisible scaffolding and shook her head. "This is a probe," she said over the cold. "He's taking your shape." Then he took enough and left. Not in a run, in a decision. He sheathed his smile and went, and the air put itself back where it had been. No one said the word victory in a place where steel was still cooling. They left at noon. The master sent them with 2 blades that remembered whose hands they'd promised to obey. Amayuri came without asking if she could, the way weather arrives after you've declared a day indoors. No one argued. The road to the coast coiled through frozen pines and down into a world that smelled like salt and old gods. Karen walked just behind Naruto, eyes half closed, listening to something he couldn't hear. Temari and Yugao set the pace without agreeing to. Tenten fixed a strap, tightened a clamp, flicked a seal into a place a person would later step and not die. They saw the sea before they heard it, gray under a sky that didn't belong to any country. Empty sky shrined sea, lung to a cliff as if built by people who hated ladders and wanted the ocean to understand it had never been consulted. Paper cords, white, soft, obscene, fluttered from poles along the cliff path. They didn't move with wind. They moved with intention. "Battery cables," Tenten muttered, disgusted. "Gods taste as trash." "Not a god," Yugao said. "An idea with teeth." Amayuri licked a finger and held it to the air like she could taste the voltage. "Someone's going to burn before night. Let's make sure it's the right someone." They didn't kick the front door. They walked in like a rumor. Temeri's diplomat voice bought 3 minutes at the gate, enough for a distracted novice to decide her seal looked official. Tenten's weighted needles turned a line of prayer flags into a ladder of shadow. Yugao's steps took the floor's pulse and agreed with it. The floor didn't squeak. Karen sent her awareness down the paper cords as if running a hand along banisters in a house full of sleeping strangers. And every place a line passed through a human, her mouth tightened. "She's here," Karen whispered. "The one with the fire." They tied her to a bell they built out of hands. "Their bell ringer," Yugao said. "No," Karen said. "Their bell. They're using her like a tongue." They found Yugito-ni in a room that had once been a library and now had the air stripped out of it so paper wouldn't rustle and call attention to itself. Blue fire leashed to white cords ran along her arms and spine, honest flame bullied into politeness. She saw them without moving her head. "You're late," she said, voice even. "And I'm going to be rude when you untie me." "Permission granted," Temari said. Naruto didn't take time to be smart about the knots. He bit Ukifun into his teeth and dragged Shinka's across a nd with a tiny cut that didn't disturb her skin and did ruin something sacred to bad men. The paper hissed. The room tried to become thin and failed because Temari was already filling it with the right kind of air. 2 cords left. Yugao took one. Tenten tossed Amayuri a clamp the lightning woman caught without looking and fixed to a third with a snap that made her grumble, appropriately impressed. They didn't get to the fourth. I thought you might come, Hakucho said from a doorway that hadn't been their last breath. He held no weapon a person's body could recognize. He flexed his fingers. A line the width of a wedding ribbon lifted from nowhere and went exactly where Naruto lived. Naruto didn't throw a speech at it. He moved how Zoro had carved into him. 4, 2, 1. He stepped and first band kissed a hair's breadth of air where his knee had just been. He raised Shinka's and the second band found its angle board and looked for a better conversation. He felt a third band like ored in someone else's mouth and turned his jaw. Then the fourth found the place none of him could move, the cord between him and the fox. Kurama's presence stuttered. Naruto didn't feel pain. He felt a hole exactly Naruto shaped and one heartbeat deep. There was a second where the world lacked its double beat rhythm. He should have screamed. He couldn't figure out why he hadn't. The absence wasn't dramatic. It was like a song stopping between notes and deciding it liked the silence better. He kept his feet. He kept his grip. He did not keep the second heartbeat. The room was a held breath. Mary's fan was halfway through a stroke she did not finish. Tenten's mouth opened to say a word that would have been a joke if the world had been kind. Yugao's eyes went flat and focused 4 inches beyond Hakucho's throat. Karen bared her teeth the way wolves do when no one is watching. Yugito, whose fire had been made into furniture, moved. She ripped one cord with her own hands and took the burn like an insult and a receipt. She turned her head toward Naruto and saw exactly what was missing and exactly what hadn't fallen. We're leaving, she said. Now. Hakucho let them hear the smallest exhale. Or, he suggested gently. We could tidy. You've all carried too much. Temari's wind hit him then, not as a gust but as resistance, a room remembering how to say no. Amayuri's blade spoke once, lightning licking Narukami's thick spine and flashing into a clamp Tenten had already set to eat it. Yugao went past the warden, not through him, and found the bell striker in the back room with a hand that refused to miss. Naruto wove breath into motion. He did not reach for what wasn't there. He reached for what was. Shinkazi's thin hum, Narukami's low one, Ukifun's honest weight in his jaw. He cut a corridor through air too polite for heroics and put civilians down it, monks who had prayed themselves empty, novices with hands like paper. Temari made the corridor not collapse. Tenten laid teeth along the floor to keep pursuit from being easy. Yugito burned any cord that tried to remember her. Karen pointed and said, left, not right, and saved them 3 floors of getting lost in someone else's story. Hakucho didn't chase hard. He walked beside. He watched Naruto move like a man taking notes for a future cut. At the threshold where the shrine's shadow ended and the cliff wind began, he lifted his hand again and placed a clean slice in the space between Naruto and the world, not cruel, merely exact. Naruto cut nothing. He stepped nowhere. He took the line in his teeth. Ukifun caught it. The mouth blade hummed against his molars and turned the cut aside by the thickness of a promise. The line hissed out over the cliff. Far below, a wave went up its own face and then changed its mind. Hakucho's eyes said interesting. Then he let the idea of pursuit go slack, and the paper cords hanging along the path suddenly remembered gravity and got obedient. The storm outside earned its name. They reached the cliff lip with air like knives and rain coming sideways. The path down was more suggestion than road. Temari took the front and made footholds out of wind. Tenten set anchor in places that looked like bad bets and turned them into odds you could live with. Yugao moved point and vanished into the kind of dark that grips ankles. She came back with it around her shoulders like a scarf. Amayuri complained loudly enough to be funny and low enough to be useful. Karen counted bonds like rungs on a ladder, calling out where empty sky pretended to be stone. Naruto carried the last line in his teeth. It wasn't heavy. It felt like responsibility the right size. He was very calm. The hole where Kurama had been was not screaming. It sat there like a chair after a friend has stood from it. They made the beach between waves. The cave waited where the cliff had eaten itself a little and kept what it liked. Someone had wedged driftwood there once. Temari's eyes found it and said later. They didn't need fire. They needed walls. They made a circle. They didn't say the word safe. That would have been a lie. Naruto sat with the 3 swords across his lap. He did not brace. He did not perform. He breathed and his body waited for the second heartbeat and it did not come and he breathed again. Karen took his wrist. Not dramatic. She sat beside him and put her fingers on high. Pulse like she'd done it 100 times with 100 people and been angry about every one of them. She listened to absence and didn't try to fill it with words. Yugao unrolled a small cloth and set 3 needles on it. Then put the cloth away without touching the needles. They were a promise to herself, not to him. Tamari leaned her fan against the cave wall and stretched the ache out of her shoulders with a wince she didn't hide. Then she watched the mouth of the cave with a stare that would argue the sea into changing its mind. Tenten built a rack for swords out of a length of rope and 2 incooperative rocks. Amayuri pretended not to be invested, scowling at her boots. Yugito stood in the mouth and held the storm back with a line of blue fire that cocked a hip at the rain. Talk later, Naruto said. I don't have the words yet. Good, Tamari said. Words are expensive. He didn't pray. He didn't know how. He counted breath. He closed his teeth around Ukifune until the Presu Ri gave him somewhere to stand inside his own skull. He remembered Zoro's rules because there were only 3 and any man could carry 3 on a bad day. Bite steel. Don't lie to your hands. No wasted cuts. He cut air. At first it was a bad idea done well. A man practicing in a cave to feel useful while the tide forgot him. But he didn't chase feeling. He chased pattern. He set Shinkaze's thin edge into a spiral that pretended to be modest and wasn't. He set Narukami's thicker voice into a second spiral that did not intersect the first until he told it to. Ukifune anchored everything with a line he could hang small truths on. He spoke none of it. He named nothing. He let his body remember other bonds so his hands could move, because anger couldn't steer but craft could. His breath got the Umber's wrong 5 times and he fixed it by moving, not by scowling. He saw Tenten's laugh in a shower of sparks, not a line of text. He found Temari's dry smile in the delicate shoulder of a down stroke. That shouldn't have been possible in a cave. He kept Yugao's 2-finger correction alive by cutting lower than pride wanted to. Karen's hand on his wrist kept time for his jaw. And Yugito, who had been a battery in someone else's church an hour ago, set blue fire along Narukami with the quiet confidence of a woman who refused to be anyone's tool again. Heat, she said, and the blade took it. Ari lifted her fan and cooled where it had to, not too much. Tenten pressed a seal to Shinkaze's spine and it woke like a cat catching a moving sun patch. Karen counted in tiny pulses against Naruto's skin. Yugao watched the storm for enemies and watched Naruto without judging him for having a hole and not bleeding out of it. The cave filled with movement that wasn't jutsu and wasn't swordsmanship and wasn't therapy and was all 3. The spiral became a story a person could cut into the air and not be ashamed of. When Naruto's jaw finally let go enough to ache in ordinary ways, something changed at the cave mouth. Not a sound, a shape. The rain paused mid-fall for a handful of drops as if embarrassed to stare. The air lifted its head. Red brushed the threshold of the cave like a beast deck, eyeing whether the humans were worth the trouble. Naruto didn't reach for it. The lesson had been taped to his ribs for years. Grab at the fox and you get teeth. He cut one more spiral and made no waste. He let the red think about staying. It didn't stay, but it didn't leave like an insult. It withdrew like a promise that had to be kept carefully or not at all. Yugito's blue fire leaned out into the rain and came back slow. He's shy, she said, and made it a joke small enough not to break anything. Naruto looked up at her. Not at the fire, at her face. Calm, older by years that hadn't left wrinkles. Catlight in her eyes when she moved. She had watched him break and not make a speech. That counted more than anything else he could think of to say. Thank you, he said. You held a cord for me, she said. I'm holding one for you. That's not debt. That's plumbing. Tenten snorted. I love a woman who explains bonds like household maintenance. Don't sleep alone, Yugao said, soft but not tender. He'll tug at you in dreams if you give him empty space. Fill the space with us. No one made that weird. Tenten slung an arm around Naruto's shoulders with professional irreverence and let weight be exactly what it needed to be. Tamari adjusted the blankets like a quartermaster pretending she wasn't fussing. Amayuri stretched out with her boots near Naruto's hip and pretended that everybody was resting near her because they liked her jokes. Karen found a spot by Naruto's other side with the kind of declaration only an Uzumaki could make without words. When he shifted, she didn't move away as courtesy. She stayed as policy. They slept in shifts that overlapped on purpose. Outside, the storm did what storms do when they've been told they matter. It raged, then sulked, then tried on new ways to be interesting. Inside, the cave kept time with breath and the smallest metallic sounds no one could have heard if they weren't listening for them. The cooling of a blade edge, the sigh of a mouthpiece set gently down. The realization when a person finally remembers they are allowed to close their eyes. Naruto dreamed of the bridge for a moment and of 3 lines in wood, bite steel. Don't lie to your hands. No wasted cuts. He woke to rain quieter than it had been in a mouthful of salt air and the knowledge that the hole hadn't closed but he'd found a way to walk around it without falling in. They climbed at first light. The cliff pretended to be taller than it was. Naruto set his feet where Tamari's wind left little markers, and Karen pointed at a place where bonds made a knot tight enough to hold. Tenten swore a little, which meant she was happy. Amayuri had thunder on her tongue again. It made her eyes bright and unkind in a way Naruto had learned to admire. Yugao went first and came back when needed. Her presence a line across a map that made everything else make sense. Yugito climbed like a cat, making a point of not being a metaphor. They didn't go back into the library room. They went to the roof. Its edge was a stupid dare above a gray ocean that kept trying to explain itself to the cliff without success. Paper charms. Hundreds. Bobbed from poles like AF. Yield of jellyfish had decided to worship the sky. The white shrine's people were there without anger, adjusting lines as if changing the arrangement of a tea service. Hakucho had taken off his hat. He did not bow. You were untidier today, he said. I approve of your progress. Naruto didn't answer. He laid Shinkas on his palm and felt the wind stretch tight across the blade like silk over a drum. Narukami hummed low and eager. Ukifune warmed where his teeth would be. He did not feel Kurama. He felt everything else. They began a war and made it look like craft. Temari's fan set lanes in the sky where, minutes ago, there had been nothing but arrogant air. Tenten anchored them to poles exactly rude enough to hold. Yugao broke hands at a distance and put men down with the privacy executioner's offer. Amayuri kissed Narukami again with lightning and laughed when the blade buzzed like a pleased animal. Yugito fed blue fire into a seam and the seam ate it and grew stubborn. Hakucho lifted Hi's hand and a slice moved through the day asking to be obeyed. Naruto answered it with a wedge of wind thin as breathing and let it cut nothing. The paper charms tried to be worship. He convinced them to be paper. He didn't chase the warden. He cut around him, through him, past him, like a man painting an outline of a face he refused to finish until the last stroke mattered. Hakucho watched, and the first time something in his gaze got a little human. Irritation, maybe, or curiosity shading toward respect. Naruto timed his breath to the others. When Tenten's anchor sang, he stepped. When Yugao's silence deepened, he moved into its cover. When Temari's wind curled off a pole, he rode it not as privilege but as plan. When Yugito threw blue heat across a gap, he let Narukami swallow what he could and return it later at a better angle. Karen's voice cut through the noise, counting bond tension in numbers that weren't math but carried math's spine. And still, in the middle of it, Hakucho reached and placed a slice where Naruto didn't have a hand to spare, cutting a bond between two people running for the safety of a stair. Naruto changed nothing about his blades. He changed what he remembered. He put their names into a small place in his mouth and kept them there while he cut a path for their feet. The slice met the name and had to consider itself. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't loss. They could have fought until the weather gave them frostbite and the shrine ran out of paper. Instead, Naruto let his shoulders drop a fraction and took a step back like a man ending a dance before the last note. He had a new shape to carry to a different battle. Hakucho studied that step backward. Leaving is untidy, he said. Good, Naruto said. I'm not a broom. They went. Not as flight, not as triumph, just as a decision. The shrine let them leave because it had other meals planned. The storm came down the cliff like somebody throwing a blanket at a fight. The path shrank. The cave took them again like it had been expecting them. They did not celebrate. They did not write a report. They ate hot food that didn't deserve to be as good as Tenten made it, and they slept in a pile tea. Hat would be embarrassing to describe to anyone they didn't trust. 2 hours before dawn, Naruto woke to the sound of rain working out its differences with the sea and a thin smell of iron and salt in the cave mouth. Red shimmered there. Not a fox head, not a hand, not a halo. Just color like muscle memory. It hovered until he kept breathing. It pushed into the cave the width of a palm and then pulled back. It did not trust him. It was deciding. Naruto didn't speak to it. He didn't reach. He lifted Ukifune with his teeth, set Shinka's and Narukami crossing at the air, and cut 2 spirals that didn't intersect until the last inch. His body said stay. His breath said stay. His hands refused to lie. Something in the red shifted like a beast turning over in sleep. The color thinned. A faint edge of warmth found Naruto's cheek and disappeared. The sea sounded a little less like a stranger. Across the storm, on a higher ledge, a man in white stood under a roof that did not get wet and watched the cave mouth glow and dim. Hakucho's face made an expression that would have been a smile on another person. On him it looked like a page being turned with clean fingers. Good, he whispered, as if pleased at a student taking to his lessons. Bonds that refuse being cut are the most elegant. The wind took his voice and unraveled it. He turned away. Somewhere behind his eyes, a godless god rolled an idea on its tongue and decided to be patient. Morning came with a sky that wanted to pretend it had never been a problem. Naruto woke to a sore jaw and a body that knew how to move without counting the hole first. He looked at the people sleeping near him and felt something old and vicious and tender settle. Not possession, not command, just certainty. They would climb again. They would cut again. They would spiral until the moment their spirals stitched something the warden couldn't tidy. Today, Tamari asked from under her blanket, eyes open, voice dry. Today, Naruto said, we start teaching the sky to take orders. Yugito sat up, hair a dark spill, blue fire banked in her. And if it doesn't, then we bite steel, he said, taking Ukifune in his teeth and standing, and we don't lie. Outside, the sea showed its teeth in a smile only sailors and fools think is friendly. Naruto smiled back, honest and small. The day was cold and the work was going to be rude. Good. Chapter 4 end. Chapter 5. Severance and the Spiral. They woke to a sky trying to pretend yesterday had been a misunderstanding. The rain had gone to sulk down the coast. Wind scratched at the cave mouth like an impatient cat. Everyone moved with the careful economy of fighters who'd slept with boots near their hands. Tamari rolled her shoulders and watched the cliff as if it might decide to argue. We won't get a second good approach, she said. We climb where it's stupid and make it smart on the way up. Tenten tightened a strap and flicked a knot that turned a coil of line into options. Anchors every 3 body lengths. If I say leave it, you leave it. I don't care if it's pretty. Yugao slid her mask into a pocket and didn't put it on. We move in lanes. If you improvise, improvise inside the plan. Karen, still pale in the morning light, closed her eyes and listened to a world that hid its scaffolding poorly. The ritual field is wide. Paper charms over the sea, strung to poles and lines you can't see until you decide to look. Their goblet is pressing through a seam that feels like the mouth of a well. If you make spirals instead of grids, you make it choke. Good, Naruto said, bitting Ukifune into place until his jaw remembered its job. Let's make it choke. They didn't waste more words. The path up the cliff learned their names as they went. Temari's fan-through shaped gusts at bit handholds out of air and pushed sand out of cracks so fingers wouldn't slip. Tenten set anchors in places that would have been jokes if she hadn't been the one telling them, pins and bolts and idle teeth that turned vertical into negotiable. Yugao went point, stepping where it was safe to ask the rest to follow. Karen counted bonds the way some people count rope strands, voice low and flat, 2 strong, 1 weak. Now 4. Now twist left. Yugito moved with the rolling balance of something that had learned from fire how to be still while moving. Naruto didn't set the pace. He set the weight. He carried the last line with his teeth and let his feet learn the climb one breath at a time. They reached the lip with forearms burning and sea air in their lungs and a view that made the La Stupid Island look like a promise. Below them, the ocean wore a ceiling. Paper charms bobbed, hundreds, thousands, each with a sealed edge and a folded heart. They rose and fell without wind like AF. Eeled of jellyfish that had decided they were stars. Lines ran through them, thin as hair, singing a song no one had a right to recognize. White shrine acolytes stood on scaffolds and walkways bolted to frescoes that had never expected feet. The warden waited near the center, where the lines made their neatest geometry. He was bareheaded, his hair a calm insult to the weather. When he turned and saw them, he didn't do anything dramatic. He just took them in and filed them in a mind that was all drawers. Sky isn't furniture, Naruto said around Ukifune. It came out clearer than it should have. Hakucho's mouth did something small and genuine. It becomes so when people exhaust it with their noise. Then stop shouting, Tamari said, and opened her fan. The first gust was a thesis. Narrow, precise, snapping the closest lines out of their smug arcs. 3 charms swung out of formation, 2 cracked, paper folding like cheap porcelain. The shock wave of that was subtle and enormous. The FLD didn't like being told it could be wrong. Lanes, Yugao said, and they made them. The paper sea didn't touch wind, wind shaped it anyway. Tenten's anchors bit the poles that needed teeth and hummed. In a way that said a good throw can be a prayer. Karen pointed where the bond tension knotted until Naruto could feel it in his own teeth. Yugito laid a strip of blue fire along Narukami's spine with a touch that made the blade purr without getting sloppy. Hakucho began as a gentleman. A band here, a cut there, an experiment in delicate cruelty. Severance drew through air with politeness and stop. Head exactly where a wrist would be if it had been offered. Naruto did not offer. He gave the bands nothing to brag about. Shinkaze's wind sheath made wedges and invite knots. Narukami took lightning fr. Omamayuri, who had appeared like weather and grinned at the opportunity to be terrible, and held it like a bank holds interest. Left line, Tenten called. Naruto shifted a half step and let a band talk. EA hook tempered anchor instead of his ankle bond to home. The anchor sang out of tune and then made a new music altogether, snapping the line into a harmless curl. Bell ringer, Yugao murmured, already gone to solve it. The man with the striker had the poor sense to look proud of his position. He never finished drawing back to strike. He never fell either. He sat down the way guilty men sit when it's over. The paper sea shuddered and then flexed again, more arrogant now that it had been challenged. Hakucho's finger moved a fraction. A bond cut clean in the lanes below, a couple mid-run letting go of each other's hands with shy confusion. Naruto felt the slice like a word misspelled in his mouth. He wanted to break things. He cut the urge into shape. Crosswind, he told Tamari. She didn't nod. She didn't have to. Wind bent. Corridors formed. The paper field sagged where she wanted and stood where she allowed. Naruto's feet learned the lanes. His jaw took the weight of Ukifune until his skull aligned. He moved through air that had been told what to do. The warden stepped out onto nothing as if the day were a floor. He didn't look smug. He looked like a craftsman in a workshop he respected. The bands coming off his hands wore mattered angles. He cut at Naruto. Not the body, but the parts that exist a fraction wider than skin, the ties named and unnamed. Naruto refused to meet them on the old terms. He split himself. The Ashura afterimage came without thinking now, steps that left sword-bearing phantoms occupying the memory of where he'd been. 6, then 8, then fewer Agai. Because too many ghosts wastes more than it earns. Hakucho's eyes tracked the first mistake Naruto didn't make. He adjusted, blade thin while seeking the living center. Naruto let him nearly find it, then wasn't there. Ukifune caught a band at the teeth and turned it by a promise's thickness. A white shrine lieutenant pushed forward, robes too clean, mouth set with the valor of new converts. Yuga, moved through him like a decision and left him evenly folded at the edge of the scaffold. She didn't watch him fall, she watched where her feet would land next. That single economy made 3 other men reconsider whose god was winning. Anchor the seam, Karen's voice cut clean through the weather. If it rips, the idea eats. Spiral it. Naruto heard it with his chest. He planted, exhaled. 3 swords drew the air tight. He didn't name the technique. He did it. Shinkas drew a line that was too thin to be seen and too honest to be lied to, a whisper of wind pulled taut. Narukami thickened eye. Chi withstood thunder until the edge hummed like a living wire. Ukifune locked the posture, jaw and spine agreeing on what forward meant. He cut again, then angled the third knot into the same path but alongside and between. A helix printed into the day. The severance band it met didn't split, it braided. The 2 halves rejoined behind the cut like stitches catching flesh that had given up. In the lanes below, a woman spun and grabbed the hand she had forgotten belonged with hers. 2 old men, mid-argument, remembered the old reason and laughed because it had always been stupid and important. The field recoiled, so did something bigger than the field. It came with no face and wrong gravity. The paper sea bowed toward the ocean as if ceding polite space to a guest. The air around Akucho pricked with cold that had nothing to do with weather. The thin white root lines that tied him to the ritual brightened, sheaths of light tightening along his forearms and throat like patient hands. The nameless thing pressed through the seam. It was not an eye, but it looked. It was not a mouth, but it tasted. When it moved, sound forgot itself, and the sky over the sea went a shade flatter. Hakucho's kindness sharpened into zeal. He placed a slice straight through Naruto's center as one offers a kindness. Clean, quick, ending future pain. The band struck, and Naruto's cut met it and refused to be a slice. The spiral spliced again. The band remained a band. Harmless, because someone had told it a better story mid-stroke. Name them, Karen said, not to Naruto's ears but to the scaffold under his feet. Which took messages better than people sometimes. He did, but not like a priest. He did it the way men do in alleys when there's no time to be sentimental and you say what you mean so you don't die stupid. Boy in waves who tied a rope wrong, Naruto said while moving. Shinkas sang. A band aimed at a dockworker broke and reknit as the dockworker remembered to keep his tools with his hands and his hands with his people. Tazuna, he added, and the old man back home sneezed and muttered about whether only he understood. Tamari, he said softly when the wind hit his back just right. And the stroke that followed contained a bone-deep respect so clean it made the next cut easier. Tenten, he said when a chain made a perfect corner, and the angle the spiral needed arrived because she'd already planned it. Yugao, when silence gave him cover. Karen, when bond tension sang in his wrist. Yugito, when blue fire poured into Narukami and did not burn him at all. The thing, pressing through the seam considered language and was displeased. It understood worship. It did not understand a man mid-fall naming people with the same mouth he used to bite a sword. It tried to take the names out of his throat. Ukifune hummed against his teeth and said no. Hakucho reached again and again, patient, elegant. No grand chops, only neat edits. Naruto parried with the stubborn grace of someone who has learned to cook on too little fire and make it taste like dinner anyway. They talked with steel. You carry too many, the warden said between strokes, and it wasn't taunt, it was concern of a sort. You cut cleaner when you empty. I cut truer when I don't, Naruto said, and slid Shinkas along Narukami's spine with a sound like cloth ripped neatly. He let the cord between the words and his hands live. Tenten took a pole with a throw that no one could have made without having done it 100 times with weights and chalk lines and pride. The field sagged. Tamari rode the sag into a lane that didn't exist a breath before and made it desirable ground. Yugao knelt a man quietly and let his line go slack where it needed to. Karen called where the bond web groaned, and Naruto placed hollow spiral there like a wedge that didn't separate so much as remind. The thing behind the paper tightened its reach in a way that made Naruto's molars sing. For a heartbeat the world blurred around edges, as if someone had cut all the outlines and held them up for inspection. People in the lanes below wavered, husbands seeing strangers in wives' faces, mothers confusing their children with the ones they'd lost. Naruto's vision tunneled, the absence in his chest yawned. Yugito stepped into his periphery, blue fire banking under her skin like a promise. She didn't touch him. She watched his breath and held it when he let his go, a rhythm he could meet, not borrow. Stay, she said, because that was the word that mattered. He did. He cut. Not deep, not dramatic. Just right. Whole. Low Spiral took a sheet of severance aimed for Temari's ribs and split it into ribbons that rewove themselves into a sash around a woman 3 bodies away who had forgotten how to hold her crying child. She picked her up and the cry shifted from terror to outrage to the lighter complaint that means the world is safe enough to be annoyed. Hakucho blinked. There it was. A human surprise. Clever, he said. He had never meant it as praise more than now. Naruto saw something then that had been shadow before. The white threads running from the warden's wrists and ribs into the seam behind him, taut. Humming with a frequency that was not his. Parasite lines. Not puppet strings. They did not move him. They fed him and took from him by increments so small you could call them choice. Hold him steady, Naruto said, already moving. Yugao's silence deepened. Men who would have cut at his back found they could not quite start the motion. Tenten's anchors found purchase that metal had no right to on painted stone. Temari's wind pressed, a hand on the warden's shoulder without touching him. Karen called the tension. There. Naruto didn't go for Hakucho's throat. He went for the threads. Ukifune locked his jaw into the line his spine wanted. Shinka's made the edge as thin as a lie you want to believe. Narukami carried Yugito's heat into places that had been bloodless for too long. He cut through the first tether with the smallest motion he had. It parted like hair under a careful blade and curled away without bleeding. Hakucho's head dropped a fraction as if something had gotten lighter and heavier at once. His next severance was an inch less perfect. Naruto cut the next thread on the inhale, not the exhale, counter to his habit, therefore harder, therefore cleaner. The third thread fought. He heard Karen's count get tight in the back of his head, and Temari's wind came up in a pulse that didn't move anything visible, only the feel of weight in the day. Narukami hummed low and mean. Shinka's whispered. Ukifune bit his teeth. The thread came free. The paper sea shuddered like a field of beasts feeling the sun. The seam wobbled. The goblet pressed harder and failed to find its mouth. Hakucho's knees hit plank, slow, controlled. He didn't collapse. He yielded to a new gravity. His hands lifted without anything in them. His eyes found Naruto's, focus finally human. I had a sister, he said. Like a man remembering what hunger tasted like as a child. Yui, I cut her out when I. Naruto shook his head once, small. Don't make it my tragedy. Hakucho shut his mouth, not chastened. Exactly. Just done with the wrong story. The paper sea began to eat itself. Not flame. Judgment. Charms folded and fell, becoming wet and trivial. The white shrine acolytes flinched. ND reached for lines that no longer hummed back. A few dropped tools. A few ran. 2 simply sat down and cried because they were not machines and the thing that had let them pretend had been removed. The god behind the seam recoiled like an eel finding no purchase. For an instant, the sky remembered all its edges at once. It made everyone dizzy and then decided to be simple again. The fight didn't end. It stopped mattering. Yugao cleaned her blade on something that wouldn't stain. Tenten hauled a boy over a rail and found his mother's hands with the efficiency of a market day clerk. Temari alt-ed wind so debris landed where no one would trip on it later. Karen watched the space where the seam had been and let her shoulders come down slowly, as if lowering a heavy bowl someone else might still need. Yugito took her flame back into her own ribs and didn't flinch when it bit. Naruto sheathed Shinka's and Narukami a breath at a time. He took Ukifune out of his teeth with care, as if removing a splinter from someone else's skin. His jaw trembled with afterwork. He let it. Hakucho knelt with his hands open on his thighs and looked at the sea like a laborer at the end of a shift. He could have run. He didn't. He breathed slow. He did not ask for absolution because he had never believed in it. He accepted consequence because he recognized craft. When he spoke, it was to the air. I will not tidy again, he said. Not like that. Good, Temari said, cool as a draft of water put on a table between people who had argued too long. If I see you cut a bond in my markets, I'll throw you out by your clever ankles. Hakucho looked at her and almost smiled. Noted. They did not arrest him. They did not make a speech. They let the lack of a god be punishment enough, and the work of cleaning a day be the rest. Afterward is what the living get. Tenten, soaked to the hips and satisfied in the way she only ever got when metal had stopped trying to be clever, wiped her hands and jerked her chin at Naruto. I want a workshop, she said. A place where we study bond injuries, not just bleeding. Karen, consult. We'll invent a ward that scares the word tidy. Give me 1 week and your worst patient. Karen's answering grin had too many teeth to be ladylike and just enough to be honest. Deal. I've always wanted to bully seals until they behave. Yugao stood with her mask in her ha. And looked at it as if deciding if it was part of her face or just a tool she'd been good at. She looped it into her belt instead. I'll file a report that makes bureaucrats climb into their drawers and nap, she said, tone mild. But I won't be busy. If he, a tilt of her head at Naruto, insists on finding where this started, I will be there when the door opens. You make good doors, Naruto said. And better exits. Yugito looked out over the sea that had disliked them from the start and softened despite herself. The blue in her eyes eased like banked embers deciding morning could be kind. When you forgot your fox, she said to Naruto, you remembered us. That's better than most men do when they have everything. He didn't reach for her. He didn't make a speech. He smiled with the RT of his mouth that still ached and said, stay for tea. Bring something that isn't desert dust, she said. I might even purr. Tamari found him later on a roof that had been dignified enough to not break under the day's weight. They sat where wind didn't have to shout. The paper sea was gone. The ocean looked like itself again, old, petty, magnificent. You made a new cut, she said. One that puts things back. Seemed fair, Naruto said. It was more than fair. It was costly. She held up a hand before he could deflect. I won't make this a diplomatic thank you. I'll make it a warning. The way you move now. It makes people want to follow you. Don't pretend you don't know how heavy that gets. He stared at the line of horizon where sky decided where to be. I won't pretend, he said. Then, lighter. When I start to be heroic and stupid, hit me with that fan. Gladly, she said, and the smile that found the edge of her mouth was not public. It was small and true and meant for him and the wind. They left the coast before anyone could decide to give them medals. The road back to the land of waves felt shorter. Bonds do that when they stop being threatened. They make distance reasonable. They reached the bridge at dawn. The air smelled like the kind of salt that keeps you honest. Fishermen sang badly and with dedication. Tazuna had retarred a stretch of planks in the most accidental way possible. Naruto put his palm over the gouged rules Zoro had left and felt the grooves like scars that healed right. Bite steel. Don't lie to your hands. No wasted cuts. He set 3 sheathed blades across his lap. Tenten and Karen had gone on ahead to bully a new workshop out of a grumpy storage shed. Yugao had disappeared in the way of people whose best work is done invisibly and would come back when needed. Yugito had found lodging that admitted cats and women with swords and had rolled her eyes into something that looked suspiciously like contentment. Tamari had a letter to WRITE that would not mention the god and would carry more weight than the god ever had. He was alone with the bridge and the wind and the stupid fondness he felt for both. He stood. He breathed with the sea. He cut the morning. Ukifun in his teeth anchored the posture Zoro had forced into him. Shinkas whispered a clean hello. Narukami hummed like thunder far off and agreeable. He set the spiral small and neat and did not waste emotion. The air answered. He felt the day stitch itself a fraction tighter where a cut had tried to live in it yesterday and been refused. Kid, a voice said, somewhere behind the wind. Not in front of him. Not on the bridge. Thicker. Like memory does when it's been dipped in salt. Naruto didn't turn. He didn't look. He just grinned with a mouth that still ached. Your timing sucks, he said. No reply. Good. He liked the world better when praise came late, implied, and brief. He finished the cut and sheathed. The bridge breathed. The sea muttered to itself abo. Oot stubborn people who didn't understand how much work it took to keep them alive. Naruto patted the rail and set off toward town with a body that knew where to put its weight and a jaw that complained about all the right things. When the first gull screamed, it sounded like laughter. Somewhere far up the coast, a man in white sat in a tea shop and warmed his hands around a cup he had paid for with coin and not consequence. A woman sat down across from him. He looked up and said her name without thinking, and when he cried it wasn't for himself. He wiped his eyes and didn't tidy it away. The cup steamed. The world failed to be perfect and decided to be good enough. Naruto walked, and the rules didn't feel like rules anymore. They felt like choices. Those were heavier. He could carry them. Chapter 5 End.